Ladies and gentlemen, the meeting is called to order. The Delta Stewardship Council. First business is to establish a quorum for the purpose of the roll call, starting with Mr. Nordhoff.
Nordhoff, present.
Here. Eisenberg here.
Totally here.
Okay. Pat Johnston will be here shortly. Miss Gray had to attend a funeral of a close friend. She apologizes, sends her regrets. It's understandable. Miss Marcus is traveling on business this week. So off we go. Chair's report, nothing other than the normal commotion and stuff. Randy and I were reflecting on the fact I was down speaking to the Southern California Water Committee yesterday, and Randy's giving me the blow-by-blow report of what I was going to say or what I actually did say, and you know how everybody gets nervous about those things. Highly amusing. Mr. Grindstaff, let's go to item number 4, please. Executive Officer's report, and start working through the pieces.
Sure. The legislature's actually adjourned at the moment, so there's not a lot happening there.
For a regularly scheduled summer vacation, the first time since 2006, I believe. Yes.
So
a month is I think they come. I can't remember the precise date. I think they return August 15. Is that Don? Is that correct? Yeah, I think that's right.
So we expect there will be a flurry of activity when they return, but for right now, there's not much going on. And with that, I'll turn to Chris for the legal update.
Thanks, okay. Joe. I'd ask Debbie Orris, our legal intern, to join us here at the table. Debbie's preparing in a couple weeks to go back to school. You'll recall she was just completed her first year of law school at UC Davis, now going into her second year. And she was here during the summer as an unpaid intern and did fabulous,
for which we are deeply appreciative.
Fabulous work for us. Joe can chime in as well.
She's been very good.
She's done real
and easier to get along with than you.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
And we hope she learned something.
Do the interns get to take their nameplates with them at least as some compensation when they get unpaid?
We'll have to check the rule books. I don't know, state
paper.
Rules.
She can have
paper.
That would be a gift of public funds and probably illegal under the Constitution.
But in all sincerity, Debbie, you've done a fantastic job, and this will be her last time speaking before you. She's got a few
Except
cases.
When she graduates, she'll be hired by all these powerful water interests, so she'll be here a lot.
Well, no, we have an agreement with our interns and externs that they can't
ever
at
return?
Least be involved on the opposite side of the Delta plan.
Okay.
But hopefully she's learned a bit.
All right. Ms. Orris, why don't you tell us what we need to know?
Okay, the first issue deals
Get a
with...
little closer to the mic, please.
Is this better?
Yeah, or pull the mic towards you. Yeah.
The first issue is an update on the Delta smelt cases. On June 24th, Judge Wagner held that the district court retains jurisdiction during the pendency of appeal to act to preserve the status quo. The issue was whether or not he has jurisdiction to rule upon the fall X2 action, which X2 is the salt line in the Delta. The federal officials are trying to push it further westward, whereas the plaintiffs are saying that that would require more water to be released, and that there's nothing.
This is the legal challenge he's presently hearing this week, I guess.
He is hearing. The hearings were being held between the 26th and the 29th. So we do not have a ruling yet on whether or not the X2 can be moved.
The request was from the plaintiff, and I think they were environmental groups primarily, was that upstream storage should release more water now to assist in fisheries and keep the X2 line further away from the Delta. At least that was, I think, the way it went.
That is the issue. Actually, that was a requirement in the biological opinions, and the parties to the suit, the people that initiated the suit, are trying to get that requirement deleted or held in abeyance until the final decision on all of the biological opinions are rendered. So, and we've been involved because our science program actually was hired and brought in an independent panel to review what you need to do if you're going to have this fall X2 adaptive management program is really what it is, because it was designed to be an experiment to see if you release more water in the fall. There have been several science papers that say that in wet years, if you release more water in the fall, you may increase the habitat for smelt, and therefore the fish might recover more fully. And releasing more water in the fall has the potential to impact exports, and so that's what they're fighting about with the judge, about whether the science that made that was behind that requirement in the biological opinion was valid, and whether it should be imposed this year.
And that's consistent with what Dr. Dom keeps telling us, that flows have to do with pulsing as much as anything else. It's not just an arbitrary level.
Yeah, in my report, I'll give you a little more details about what our science panel came back to us with, which is basically guidance on if the action does occur, what kind of scientific overlay would you then use to actually address whether this is an effective measure or not.
Okay. I interrupted you. I
That's okay.
apologize.
Also, in regards to Delta Smelt, the federal defendants have all filed appeals to the Ninth Circuit. So that's the next step. The next issue is the Army Corps levee maintenance policy, which
This is stripping the levees of vegetation so they're
correct.
stronger or something.
Yes, their policy is clear cutting of all vegetation on or within 15 feet of levees. A coalition of environmental groups, including Friends of the River, Center for Biological Diversity, and Defenders of Wildlife, have filed suit to prevent implementation. They also state that the current variance program is burdensome and vague, and they wish the Corps to rework this policy. The third issue I have is California Supreme Court has ordered a new review of weather land surveys by Department of Water Resources to prepare for a new conveyance alignment is legal. The lower court held that the state cannot drill upon private land, but they can continue walking upon the farmers' lands. The farmers argue that this amounts to taking a temporary easement, and they should be justly compensated under eminent domain law. The last issue I have is two cases involving an area of origins dispute. One is with Tehama Calusa, and that's in Judge Wagner's court. They argued it's a group of Sacramento Valley water districts claiming they should get their entire allotment of water before anyone in San Joaquin Valley. They based this claim on the area of origins law in the water code, which states that property owners, cities, and other entities and counties where rivers originate should get preferential water allotment before anyone else. And we're still waiting on a decision for this case.
And I am correct, I assume, that the area of origin laws don't specify how much water they get, just preferential right to get whatever they are entitled to get?
That's what I gathered from what we've received so far.
Yeah.
And then in Butte County, which is in state court in Sacramento County, the county's promised and pays for 27,500 acre-feet of water a year, but they only receive a small fraction of it. Currently, they're only using 2,500 acre-feet of water a year. They argue that based off of an area of origins law, which dates back to the establishment of the Oroville Dam, that they should receive their full allotment despite shortages.
And even though they couldn't use it physically?
Correct. They have a few contracts with other counties that they would sell the water to, but they can't fulfill this because they're not even getting the water.
Mr. Stevens, perhaps at a future meeting it might be worth resurrecting some of the background material from the Attorney General and others on area of origin and Delta Protection Act and unquantified water rights. And also address the question, I know that for riparian water rights, you can't just build a dam somewhere, take all the water you want and sell it to somebody else, but how does that apply to the other more generic, unquantified water rights? That would be important to get some background on. Okay.
That's it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Excuse me. There. Next item to report is the written report on contracts. You have that in front of you if you have any questions about any of those contracts.
This is File 4, Tab B, and as you recall this is done now quarterly, right?
It is done
This is
quarterly.
this is quarterly, and this is a status report on the entire history of extant contracts, some going back to 2006?
Yes.
Is it 2006? So these are cumulative totals. These are not quarterly totals. Anything in this that is substantially different from previous reports, Mr. Grindstaff?
Nothing significant. I mean, there are, you can see in there the new contracts that we've entered into, but there's nothing significant. And significant things we have a couple that we'll talk about later today. In
Yes,
fact, the
yes.
next item is one, and then we'll talk about
Yeah, our own contracts. But to a large extent, this reports the funding of scientific activity and other activities from CalFed Delta days that have been transferred to us effective whatever the date was, 10th or the 1st.
It does,
of
and
last year.
we awarded, as you'll recall, we brought to the council approval for grants to a number of entities, and those contracts are all in here because we've now entered into agreements to implement the action that the council took. So you will find, and you have the dates here, when the contracts start, when the end date is, and for the amounts. So it is cumulative. As long as there is an open contract, we'll track it and bring it to you, and anytime we have a new one, it will show up on this list. I've been thinking that in the future we'll probably want to highlight the new ones in red or something so it's
I think
easier
that's
for
right.
you to see.
Yeah.
Cliff, just
Hank?
a question out of curiosity. The top of page 3 of 6, the UC San Diego, a large $7.6 million. Is that primarily with Scripps, or are there other schools within UC San Diego?
This is the Science Fellows contract, Cliff.
I was going to say, I think this is a multiple-year contract that involves competition that the Sea Grant program at Scripps runs for us to select our postdoctoral and predoctoral fellows that we award 2-year awards to carry out research in the Delta. So this reflects probably multiple classes over a significant period of time, and it's run through the Sea Grant program, which is housed at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography.
I was wondering if Scripps wouldn't concentrate on saltwater as opposed to freshwater, but I guess they do both.
They do a fair amount of coastal and estuarine work also. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the quarterly contracts? If not, then, Joe, I believe we have a contract amendment to discuss.
Yes, we do. The next item is we have a contract with ABAG that we use when we bring in experts for some of the science panels that we're asked to do. And in order to accommodate the quick time requirements that we have used ABAG. We're trying to switch over to do those things internally. We have a number of requests, some of which, by the way, we can't meet just because we don't even have the staff to do the legwork to get the contracts in place, to get the questions laid out properly for an independent expert panel. But in order to do the ones that we can do, we need to extend this contract with ABAG as the area governments for the Bay Area. So if you have any questions, I'm sure Sam would be happy to stand up and answer questions about that.
Any questions for Sam? All right. So what's your recommendation?
Our recommend is we recommend that you approve the executive officer amending the existing contract in the amount of $75,000.
All right. It appears we're going to have to hold off on that action since we don't have a quorum currently. Can we postpone that until our chair returns? All right. Then the next item is 4D, implementation of the Delta plan.
Yes. I was hoping actually to have the 5th draft Delta plan released today. And it's not there. Actually, when I was in LA, I was told that there was, on our website, a new date had appeared of Tuesday. and they had warned me about that. Keith tells me that I sometimes live in a fantasy world about dates, so I will acknowledge that. So the fifth draft of the Delta Plan is in final production, if you will. Expect it to be out on Tuesday. The EIR is more difficult because you're talking about more than 1,000 pages of documentation which has to be reviewed by our attorneys intensely, and there's a process underway of consultants giving it to the attorneys making comments and going back and forth on that. I do not expect that to be released for another 3 or 4 weeks, maybe by the end of August. That's difficult and will have an impact on our schedule, but having been through litigation on EIRs before, the CalFed litigation took 7 years. I think it's well worth our time to make sure that we do the best we can to do it right. And so that's why having the attorneys review it intensely is really important rather than this. I've also done EIRs that nobody pays any attention to. And I would say 99% of the environmental documents that are done in the state have a few people paying attention, but in general, most people don't pay much attention to them at all. Our expectation is that we will be sued. We certainly know that we will have lots and lots of comments, and so we want to make sure we get the EIR right. So that's the delay. It's going to be intensely reviewed by our attorneys, and I'm worried even more about the schedule if we end up getting the thousands of comments that is possible to get. As you know, we've gotten many, many comments on the draft Delta plans as they've gone through. With each version, we've gotten probably thousands if you separate out the individual issues. Thousands.
Well, we've gotten communications from probably 200 groups and individuals,
maybe
that's
a
accurate. Bit more, but each of them raised multiple points, and the multiple points are in the thousands.
That's
so
true.
One of them was an email-generated letter from members of, I think, the Sierra Club, but don't hold me to that. We probably got a couple thousand duplicate copies of that. They're counted as individuals, but they're actually a mass.
They are. Yeah. The way the law is, when an EIR is complete, we are required to respond to each comment that comes in. So that will be an intense workload. So I just want to let you know that that's out there, and this process is going to be logistically difficult, and we're going to come back. I was going to try and have a schedule today. Keith was going to draft one up and say, okay, this is the new schedule. But I want to make sure. I told all of my staff I don't want to come in and put a schedule on the table and then come in and do another schedule a month from now and another schedule a month after that. When we put out a schedule, I want it to be real for the next one. So we are delayed in getting the EIR out when I come out with the new schedule, which I hope is this next week. I want it to be a real schedule. We've got conflicting advice even about how long the comment period has to be open. So,
well, look, we've got a statutory deadline to commence implementation of January 1st, 2012. That, for me, is the date that is relevant. The inner workings of the procedural notices and releases and all that it seems to me, of less importance than meeting the statutory mandate. And so I'm open to suggestions, but the statutory mandate for me is the operative.
And that is still our plan.
Yeah. Okay.
Just a question on that, though, that recognizing legislative...
Could you get that little mic a little closer?
Recognizing the legislative mandate, but if you get sued on an EIR, you can't implement until that suit's settled in a lot of cases. I mean, depending upon the nature of that, is that correct? So, I mean, you can work at the pace we're working at, but it would seem to me that we need, as Joe has said, and I certainly concur with that, having sat through where we've been challenged on environmental documents from time to time, that if you go off to the courts, it may not take 7 years in some cases at the local level, but they basically put everything to a halt. depending upon the nature of it. So I guess I think we just need to continue to work at the pace, but also
every time I talk to people tell me, well, you're moving too fast or too slow. No one says you're doing the right speed. But basically what it means is if you do what we want you to do, you certainly should proceed. And all I know is legislature told us to develop our plan and start implementing by a certain date. If litigation halts the implementation, that's within the scope of the laws of the state of California. But until the plan is finished, it's awful hard to figure out what the litigation would be about. So, by the way, I should probably report to you, I learned a secret yesterday. Our staff is developing a list of nicknames for us, and I understand, Mr. Grindstaff, that you are known among the staff, at least the media staff for sure, as Moose Grindstaff. I do not know why particularly.
And I had not ever heard that before.
I know, and I would.
Now he tells the whole world.
At the next meeting, would you schedule a time for the staff to reveal all of their nicknames for all of us?
Well, what is their nickname for you?
Well, they didn't tell me. They didn't tell me.
Can't put it over the air.
Hank. Hank.
Just in a less light vein, forgetting about implementation, I mean, do we have to have a plan put together and cleared by the committee? Does that constitute as much as we can do? And is that by the end of this year?
In order to implement the plan, I think the plan needs to be complete by the end of the year, yes.
And complete means what?
There are two potential definitions of complete. One is that it's actually enforceable having gone through the Secretary of State and Office of Administrative Law, and we'd like to do that.
How long does that normally take?
That could take up to 60 days.
That's really beyond our control.
So that is beyond our control. We can complete our work by the end of the year and forward it to them and say, implement this, or make this into law, essentially, make this a regulation. We could begin implementation, certainly at that point, of all of the things that we have control over and of all the recommendations we have. It wouldn't be enforceable on covered actions until the Office of Administrative Law and Secretary of State have gone through their full process and put it into the regulatory code. Is that what they do with it? So that's when it's fully implemented, I would say.
So if we were to get something to them in December?
If we get something to them in December, I think we could feel that we've completed our mandate to that point. Understand that people...
Early December?
Yeah.
To have a reasonable chance of it being cleared?
To have a reasonable chance of it being cleared, probably honestly by February. It needs to be in December. And when I look at the timeline, that may mean that we actually have to do it in mid-December in order to get the timeline done. And that's
which you may recall from a meeting. I'm trying to remember that February or March. We talked about the process as we do most times, and Mr. Stevens and other staff have already been consulting with preliminary drafts with the Office of Administrative Law, which is, they don't tell you what they're going to do, but you keep them informed as you go along, laying the groundwork, hopefully, for an expeditious review.
So, and what happens is we adopt the Delta Plan, so that part would be done. The Delta Plan would be adopted in effect, but the regulations, the regulatory part of the plan, which goes forward under separate cover, is not in effect until such time as it gets posted by the Secretary of State.
So it's reasonable for us to shoot for a drop-dead date of December 15th? And we would be in conformity with the spirit and the letter of the law, the legislation?
Chris?
The spirit and the letter of the law. Yeah, well, I think that...
Are you familiar with those terms?
I'm becoming less and less familiar as my career progresses. No, in all seriousness, I think that I concur with what Joe says. We can put out a realistic schedule here shortly that can get you to a place, hopefully, where you can adopt the plan in December, and then we can forward it to the Office of Administrative Law after that. And as Joe said, the regulatory portions of your plan won't become effective until it runs through that process. Some can say that that means implementation, but you're right. Once we adopt the plan in December, we have adopted the plan. We have met the statutory mandate. There's another date in the Delta Reform Act that we are cognizant of, and that's a March date where we're supposed to report to the legislature, this is March 2012, on the progress of the plan and how far we've come. And I think that dovetails nicely with assuming that we can adopt it in December, with it becoming effective shortly thereafter, working its way through the process. But I'll put a finer point on what Joe was hinting at. I'll be even more blunt that this is still going to be an aggressive schedule. I think that what you have to keep in mind is your mission is to put out the best plan that you can put out, keeping in mind that you have a statutory deadline. We'll try to get you a schedule that can get you there, but you've got two processes, the environmental review process that will be started shortly, that's supposed to inform your ultimate decision. And you have some great stakeholders and very insightful comments that have come in and that will come in. And those should inform your ultimate decision. Likewise, on the Office of Administrative Law, the rulemaking side, a separate process. But again, that's got a 45-day public comment period. You'll be holding a hearing. You have to respond to comments with regard to those issues. And again, they're going to be insightful comments. So, ultimately, you want to adopt the best plan you can, keeping in mind that you have a statutory mandate. Joe has committed to putting out a schedule that, while aggressive, will get you there. But that's in the best of all circumstances. If there are changes, if you make substantive changes to the plan after you've put it out for public review, you may have to recirculate. Right. It will add time. So I think Joe's trying to add a sense of realism to this.
Look, I don't mind the recirculation if substantial changes, as defined by law, require them. I mean, that's. But what I don't want to do is get in a process where, after having spent, what is this, the 15th month we've been doing this, everyone's saying we're meeting our statutory deadline, somehow not meeting the statutory deadline. If we have to change because we have learned new things or there is new information that require a change and require a recirculation, of course. Yeah. Of course. You do that.
I agree.
Yeah.
Do we have any control over the EIR? Can we say that all the comments must be in by a certain date?
Yeah, we do. There'll be a 45-day public comment period, after which you cut it off. Okay. But the tight schedule that we're under, we're going to have to, as Joe said, you have to respond to all of those comments. That's the law. And so that we will.
But each response need not be a tome.
No, they don't. And some responses can be aggregated based on the nature of the question. So if they're all common questions. So, we can do it. We've got a good consulting team. They've done a lot of these before. We've got some good outside counsel looking at this. And, we can do it. We can set up the resources. But it's going to be tight. So.
Would it be reasonable to adopt a date of December 16th, which is a Friday?
I want to look at the schedule before I commit to December 16th or December 19th or whatever the date is.
But I think we should commit to a date so we all have something to shoot for.
I'm willing to commit to December 31st, but
that's not really reasonable, is it?
Yeah, no, it's got to be before
you've got Christmas time
so it's got to be.
You've got to give them a shot.
How about the week before Christmas, before the Christmas week?
Why don't we do this? Before the meeting closes today, let's circle back. That'll give the staff time to think about this.
Yeah, I was going to say that in your last motion at the last meeting, I think the first point was actually directing staff to reserve a date in November and to certify the EIR and to adopt the plan. And so I think that we've already kind of hinted or suggested, you've given us direction that that's where you want us to go. This is going to push it back a bit. But I think Joe's right. We've got to confirm what the actual date is going to be, because you have to work backwards on the timeline to get you to where you have to be.
And it would seem that the EIR is the most important thing that we have some control over. And it's got to be a certain period of time after the cessation
Both the
of
EIR
comments.
and then we're required to have a 45-day comment period with the Office of Administrative Law also. So we have both of those things. And I just turned on my phone, so I will look at the calendar.
And then before the meeting ends today,
Before the meeting
we'll circle
ends,
back
we'll circle
and
back
talk
and
about
say
whether it's possible to identify a date right now, or a more a closer
Yeah.
date. Yeah, okay.
Okay, fine.
All right, let's go back to item 4C. I apologize. Ms. Gray had called me to apologize again. The funeral she's attending for her friend is this morning, and she apologizes that she can't be here. I stepped out. We didn't have a quorum on the Delta Science Program contract amendment discussion. Had we discussed that, Randy?
Yes.
We discussed it, and I will offer the staff recommendation.
Okay, is there a second? Mr. Nordhoff?
Second.
All right, starting with Mr. Nordhoff, call the roll.
Nordhoff, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Totally aye.
Okay, that is adopted. Okay, Mr. Grindstaff, anything else under the executive officer's report?
no, I think we've talked about it.
I'm sorry, Moose.
Moose.
Yes.
They could have done bear or something like that.
No. Okay, let's go to item number 5. Dr. Dom, the lead scientist report. Members, file tab 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 4 items that I'd like to share with the council today that highlight some activities that have occurred since our last meeting. The first item that I want to highlight is 2 weeks that I spent at 2 back-to-back conferences in Spain. The first one was a conference of the Society of European Freshwater Sciences. They meet every other year. This was the 7th meeting of this group. I was on the program committee, so I was invited to participate as a participant. I went to Girona, which is outside of Barcelona, where this meeting was held. They had about 600 scientists from all over Europe attending the meeting. About a similar number of talks and posters were given. Just a couple observations on this. The Europeans are wrestling with many of the very same kind of co-equal goal issues we have here. Certainly water supply in systems that have high human population density and large amount of infrastructure, and maintaining basically healthy ecosystems with natural biodiversity are some of the big issues that they're wrestling with. I was going to comment just briefly on a slightly different approach, though, that they approach the way that they're doing their sciences. One thing that you see in Europe these days is because of the EU framework, many of the studies that are done tend to be very regional in nature. You rarely have a scientific group in one country doing a study. You tend to have groups from 6, 8 different countries doing the same study and then looking for commonalities and comparisons. So lots and lots of the reports there were basically studies where people were doing work in Sweden and Greece and Spain and France and Great Britain, and then trying to see if some of the kind of research that they're doing leads to some generalities and some of the work that gets published. They do also do quite a bit of what I would consider to be very applied sciences. A lot of the resources are going into them meeting the framework directives that they've generated in Europe to basically improve the quality of their water systems and to protect their native biodiversity. And those tend to be 2 of the major themes that you see in many, many of the presentations. They also, because of this emphasis both on biodiversity and human infrastructure, a lot of the studies and a lot of the reports have to do with the interface between science and economics and socioeconomics. And so many of the talks also dealt with issues of cost effectiveness of various types of measures or different types of actions being done in different systems. So it was an interesting opportunity for me to re-engage with many of my European colleagues and to see a little bit about some of the issues that they're wrestling with. Certainly the co-equal type of goals, front and foremost, particularly in the more southerly parts of Europe, this whole issue of meeting human water supply needs and maintaining vital and healthy ecosystems is front and foremost in a lot of the presentations. The second meeting I went to was a meeting in Madrid, and this was an invitation-only conference that involved 12 scientists from around the world. It was supported by a foundation that was formed by one of the large banks in Spain called BBVA. That foundation invited 12 people to try to represent basically all the continents of the Earth to talk about issues of river conservation. And so the 12 of us met. A couple firsts for me. One is first time I've ever given a presentation where it was simultaneously translated. It's quite an entertaining to have that happening. And it was the first time I've ever given a presentation where in the room where I presented on the walls were original paintings by Goya, Picasso, and Dali. Pretty amazing. The 12 of us are going to write a book that will be disseminated both electronically and as a hard copy. I've agreed to be part of 2 chapters of the book. One of the chapters that I'm going to be engaged in writing and will be doing drafts in the fall is going to be a chapter that I'm going to write with a colleague from Australia, Andrew Bolton. And it's going to be a comparison of science, policy, and planning here in the California Delta and in the Murray-Darling Basin. So I get an opportunity to write about you all. So it should be an interesting opportunity. And it's one of the 2 chapters that I've committed to. The second chapter that I've committed to will be a group of scientists who are going to try to pull together positive examples of conservation or restoration of rivers throughout the world. And we'd like to try to get nice examples of things that have been effective on all the continents, at least all of the inhabited continents. And so that's going to involve probably 7 or 8 different scientists. We're going to bring in colleagues, for example, from Japan and from South Africa, in addition to some examples here from the United States and from Europe and South America. So those will be my 2 sort of post-meeting products that I'll be working on here on the fall.
Chris, in your chapter, are you going to change the names to protect the guilty?
I might be using nicknames, it sounds like. Moose might be fairly prominent in this. Right. I do need to get a list of all the nicknames that are being used, though. I think it'll be an interesting opportunity. And one of the nice things about this foundation is it's well endowed, and so that the books will just be disseminated free to anyone who would like copies of them. And then also they're going to use these electronic outlets so that people can come and download it. It's going to be in English. Yeah. So those are my back-to-back meetings in Spain that I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on. The second thing is to follow up on some of the on this review panel that was already discussed a bit during your legal update. We brought together 6 researchers to look at a draft document that had been prepared about what kind of scientific information would be gathered if the fall action of moving the salinity gradient westward actually occurs in the months of September, October, and November. So this is under litigation. The action may or may not occur. But if the action does occur, we feel it's important that information actually be gathered that will help address whether this is an effective action. It's a controversial action. It's an action that I think needs to be studied in detail, and our panel was very, very strong in basically telling the agencies that you need to utilize this opportunity if it presents itself to you to maximize the information that you get. Now, the information is focused on whether this improves the status and health of the Delta smelt, but it also gives you an opportunity to look at how it affects food webs, the community of fishes, the various interactions between those fishes. And so draft study design was reviewed. The report is now posted on our website. And I think the panelists, the 6 panelists that we brought in, 3 who've had a lot of experience working in the Delta and 3 new people that we felt brought some new perspectives, is a well-written and I think useful document, and I hope that the agencies and the people who would be involved in this action will utilize it in designing their study plan, which basically is, if it does occur, is going to be starting here in about 6 weeks. So that is online, and if you'd like to see a copy of it, I have hard copies with me, but also it's posted on our website. The third item I wanted to bring to your attention is that 2 of our communication tools came out in this past month. We hope that you're getting notifications of these. If you're not, please let us know. But the two communication vehicles are the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science Journal and Science News.
I'm on that email distribution list, and I'd ask that members be put on. I don't know if you've been getting the notice. Randy, have you? Just something. If you just check, one of the things I've learned is that at some point we've set up Delta Council email addresses, and people either check that email address or they don't, and they have their own. So Joe and the staff will know which ones members use most readily. I think that is very interesting. Very interesting.
So I just wanted to briefly highlight one item out of each of those two communication vehicles. And one of them actually is written up as a paper that was published about the migration patterns of Delta smelt. I'm actually not going to highlight that one. I'm going to highlight another paper. This is mostly for Hank Nordoff's information. I think he's been very interested in these issues that relate to the interface between economics, engineering, and hydrology. And we have a paper in the journal that's written by Stacy Tanaka and a group of engineers and economists and hydrologists looking at, basically the title is Economic Costs and Adaptations for Alternative Regulations of the California Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. It's basically looking at what the implications would be of different kinds of delivery patterns, different timing, different amounts, and how they would be affected and who would be affected by some of these various changes. They use a modeling tool called Calvin to basically do these runs. They're basically looking at, for an equivalent amount of average delta water, either dedicated to outflow or changing the timing of the actual export, what those effects might be on the system. And so some of the take-home messages are that that freshwater, to keeping freshwater in the delta year-round will require a certain amount of outflow. That's a little less costly than basically some restrictions on pumping that would actually reduce exports to the state of California. And then they also go into an economic analysis of where these effects are going to be most prevalent and who has the ability to be more adaptive to some of these kind of changes. And one of the bottom lines there is that the southern Central Valley would be the most affected economically by some of these suggested changes.
That study appears to be maybe a little broader, but not dissimilar to the work you and Chris Enright had done. Was it earlier this year, late last year, on flow alternatives under different scenarios? It wasn't so much focused on the economics, but it was on the variable impact. And
yeah, our focus was really on taking water as the hydrograph provided additional water and using a percent of flow reduction and how that might work, and comparing that to the actual present operations. We did not go into the economics. Right. This much goes very much into the economic effects then of some of these various alternatives.
Hank?
Cliff, the Delta smelt appears to be the poster fish for the Delta. Is that the right species we should be looking at? And why is it that we talk about, the health and everything else as measured by the population of the smelt?
Well, the smelt is a threatened species, and so there's legal requirements that we look closely at. There are many other threatened and endangered species within the system. It is the one that much of the legal action has been focused around. I think our legal counsel could talk a little bit more about some of those decision making, but it's a species that has had long-term protection and has, because of the of that individual species being litigated in the courts, it's become a major determinant of water export and basically restrictions on exports.
I want to point out it has not always been Delta smelt that's driven the system. If you go back into the 80s, striped bass, which is a non-native species, was very important to people. In the early 90s...
On the other side, trying to keep the population down?
No, trying to raise the population.
Pardon?
Trying to raise the population of striped bass.
It's still the most economically successful sport fishing species, I guess, in California.
But it is a predator, is it not?
It is a predator, but at that point, people weren't as worried about. Yes, they fish eat other fish.
Well, almost all.
Many do. And in the early 90s, if you go back to the drought of the early 90s and the regulatory pressures that kind of came around that time, those pressures were focused on salmon, particularly winter-run salmon. And as We actually had some improvement in salmon. Not that they're doing well, but there was some improvement. They seem to be less of the focus. And the pelagic organisms, where delta smelt is probably the most prominent of those.
Although there are 4 species that are actually looked at in the pelagic organism decline quite closely. So it includes 2 smelts, the young stripe and the young striped bass.
But you're satisfied that delta smelt is a good representative?
It's one that we know a lot about, and it's one that there's a lot of information. I'm going to end this report with basically some information on what we know about what's happened in the last year with the delta smelt community. Okay.
Yes.
And then Science News had, as a feature article, a nice interview and description of ongoing work on historical ecology of the California Delta. And this is done by Allison Whipple and Robin Grossinger. I wanted to highlight a couple points on that paper. First thing I would say is that I think many of the people that live in the Delta have gotten up and spoken to you about the uniqueness of the place, the importance of the place, and also the heterogeneity of the place. And I think the historical ecology is also bringing to light that the Delta is a very heterogeneous place, and it was historically a very heterogeneous place. The North Delta was quite different than the South Delta or the West Delta. And the work that they've done to go back and sort of reconstruct how conditions were 200 or 300 years ago is a very nice study to give us some context of what the deltas looked like. It was not just one large tule marsh. That certainly is a false impression, and they go into some details explaining what the basically both the terrestrial and aquatic landscape looked like in the delta pre-European development of the delta. So it's worthwhile, and some nice maps also characterizing some of their work. And then finally, the last item, just to give you some updates on some surveys that have just come out. They've been in the press here of late. The Interagency Ecological Program conducts these year-round fish monitoring surveys, and 2 of them have just come out related to delta smelt. One of them is the 20-millimeter delta smelt index. This is basically an index. The methods are sort of described in the handout that was given you, but basically looking at some indication, an index that gives you some indication of the numbers of these fish that are about 2 centimeters long or about an inch long. And so the latest survey in 2011 has seen a substantive uptick. It's gone from 3.8 to 8.0, and again, this is just an index. But just point out that the movement is in the right direction. Certainly not to imply that the species is out of the woods, but at least we're seeing movement in a direction that's desirable. And then finally, also the Tomanet Delta Smelt Survey also has shown a significant, well, at least a nice uptick, and that is it's gone from 0.8 to 2.2. The Tonet Delta Smelt Survey, one of the nice things about it is it has a very long database to compare to. So it's been done since 1959 to the present, so you can really get a good sense of status and trends because of that long historic database. The 20-millimeter Delta Smelt Index has been going on since 1995, so not quite as long of a database, but still, in both cases, you can see that there are movements in a positive direction this year for both of those indices for delta smelt.
Randy?
Cliff, I can remember conversations not too long ago when it was suggested that maybe we're reaching the point where delta smelt could be delisted because we had a nice uptick in populations. Any comments about how the 10-year period ago compares to now?
I think the positive direction, way too premature to start talking about delisting, but a few good strong years like this, you could actually then get populations back where things would be a whole lot better than they have been. Again, you have to, I think, put it in the context of what kind of a year we've had this year, too. It's been a very wet year with good high flows. So, I think, to some extent, this is may be reflecting actions, but also it may be reflecting natural variability. So I think we need a longer-term trend before those kind of decisions will get made.
One of the things I think we've agreed to do is at the next meeting, Dr. Mueller-Solga is going to come here and talk about this kind of information in a little bit more detail, which the Interagency Ecological Program in part has assembled. But that also led to some email exchanges between you and the doctor, and I got copies of them, about the fact Anka has her own way of expressing it, but my summary is that we monitor a lot of things, but we never do a great job of evaluating, trying to consolidate the different monitoring techniques and getting a broad picture. And these two charts, I think, are so interesting because of the time deadline. One goes back to 1959, the other goes back to 1995. But do they tell the same story? I mean, you do use different techniques. You hope that you get a broad picture. Is that a... I mean, she clearly thinks, and my impression is that's a problem. Funding science is okay, but people still want to find the answers that justify whatever it is they want to achieve. And I look at this and I say, I'd sure like to know if we could ever find out, is there any information prior to 1959? Because I looked at this and I said there were two major reductions in smelt population that just appear to occur over time. What caused them? I mean, I understand their arguments. It's that evaluative process of independent studies that I'm kind of interested in.
Well, Anka was in my office yesterday actually talking about this very same issue, and that is she's feeling like a lot of the scientific efforts that are going on with the Interagency Ecological Program is putting a lot of time and effort into continuing these databases and getting the information that you're seeing in these type of diagrams. But where she feels that the system really needs some retrofitting and innovation is that the synthesis and integration and communication of that information to people that can actually act on it is something that they have very little time to do. They feel like they're spending all of their time just basically getting the information and putting it into a database. The kind of thoughtful synthesis and integration where that information then gets out and is communicated widely and is communicated to the public, communicated to people like you, is where she feels like they're not doing as good a job as they should be. And I think she'll probably speak to that next month, but clearly I concur with her on that. One of the things that we put in the adaptive management diagram that's in Chapter 2 is that we really need to put as much emphasis on the synthesis, integration, and communication component as we do on the designing and gathering of the data. And I certainly concur often that's what tends to get neglected, and it also takes the right kind of people. You can't, somebody who can go out and make a measurement very well is maybe quite different than somebody who can take measurements of 30 or 40 different types of variables and actually synthesize that in a way that it actually communicates and tells a story effectively.
The other thing on this point, and Hank alluded to it earlier, there's a tension that's around, and I've recently called them vexing questions. But one of the vexing questions to me is we're ordered to protect the Delta ecosystem, but the most effective legal leverage has been a species by species litigation built up historically. And how do you move to a coherent ecosystem evaluation and ecosystem approach as opposed to the isolated preference by preference water development idea or endangered species idea that everybody complains about, but nobody's willing yet to risk a new format, a new understanding, a new approach. It's very painful to do, but I think really important. Randy.
Let me try and piggyback on that and add to that question. How do you take an environmental law requirement to deal with single species, single stressor, and move it to a multi-species, multi-stressor approach to ecosystem health?
Yeah. And it applies for water resources too, because the interesting thing, at least I think the interesting thing, we have co-equal goals. But the co-equal goals on the ecosystem are not quantified in a systematic way. But on water supply, they're quantified by contracts, they're quantified by, in some cases, water rights that are identified and specified. They're certainly quantified by demands or expectations of water. So you have a consolidated co-equal goal with one side kind of amorphous and the other side quantified. But the reality is, whether it's a water supply or an ecosystem preference, we hear from the science, there's no way you can guarantee 100% of much of anything if your demands are unlimited on all sides. If they're unlimited demands, you can only satisfy that with unlimited supply. Pretty clearly, we don't have an unlimited supply of water or ecosystem. So how do we handle it? It's kind of it is a very complicated question, but really important. And, this little activity we're engaged in, I suspect, is part of the process of moving environmental laws and water management into a new format, structure, approach that is more ecosystem and more realistically water allocated, directed than the present system we've kind of inherited over 150 years. I don't know what the right approach is, but I know the direction we're headed, but we're stumbling there, and maybe in the few months remaining before we vote on the Delta plan, we might be able to refine that a little bit more clearly. I know Felicia's talked about the same thing, Randy's talked about it, I've talked about it, Don talked about it at one time on trying to balance in a rational way of the interest, including the community interest. Anyway.
There's no question these are very challenging and difficult questions, and certainly one of the other things that you can look to are some other examples. The European framework really is looking at protecting biodiversity, but it's not on a species-by-species basis as best I understand it. It's really protecting overall biodiversity by taking more of an ecosystem or regional approach to the to biodiversity. But we have a legal framework that has us protecting individual species, but we're also looking towards management plans that do multi-species conservation. So, as time goes on, I suspect we'll see some movement in the legal framework under which we work. My personal preference is to focus on an ecosystem or even a landscape perspective, but yet the mechanism in place is protecting species by species.
Hank.
I guess that's an approach avoidance situation for me. I guess ideally, in some ways, we're looking at an equation so that the economic would equal the environmental, and you can change variables and come out with, if it gets higher on one side, then you got to be offset on the other side. But it's probably good that it is qualitative on one side of the equation and quantitative on the other, because the only measure I can see that the least common denominator would be economics. And there I think you'd get into a big brouhaha. Is 1 million acre feet equal to how many
any approach will get into a big brouhaha, I predict.
So I think we'll probably have to limp on with what we have now, and maybe because it is non-precise, maybe take some comfort in that. Yeah. Because the economics will shift over time.
Yes, they will.
An economic valuation of things like high water quality or good habitat are much harder to delineate than amount paid for an acre foot of water.
Exactly. They change and our values change as a society. So I did want to point out that there are implications in this discussion for the financing of what we need to do as we implement the plan. We could continue on with just kind of the staff we have, the Delta Conservancy and the Delta Protection Commission, round numbers for $10 million a year. And we've talked about the fact that we really need to think about science, and Anka has got proposals for how we could, for another couple $1 million, probably do a better job of trying to synthesize scientific data on an ongoing basis. And then we have the studies that we're doing. And one of the key things we have to do is actually sit down and figure out with all of the other agencies that are spending money, what are the right things to do. We have been spending on the order of $20 to $30 million a year on monitoring through IEP. And so how is it that we can take advantage of all of that and kind of change or improve the program as we move ahead? And that's a real challenge that comes out of all this discussion. It will lead to changes in what we fund and the kind of work that we do, and hopefully doing that will then change our ability to make decisions going into the future.
Let me leave you with just one comment that came from one of my colleagues from the University of Hong Kong, David Dudgeon, who's been looking at some of these issues on a global perspective. And one of the things that he does point out is that when we look at rivers and deltas of the world, 40% of the fish community is either gone or about to be gone. similar numbers for amphibians, and even higher for freshwater mussels. So we do have a biodiversity challenge that is worldwide. We're part of that overall puzzle, but it is severe and basically something that these kinds of stresses are most prevalent in our flowing water, freshwater systems of the world. This is where the biodiversity crisis is coming to light, first and foremost.
I'm sorry, Randy.
Cliff, generally speaking, when we see a decline in a particular area of noted species, do we also see a relative increase in other species, perhaps introduced species in that same environment?
I don't know if I can give you a very good general answer. Certainly, some of the studies that I know, there is sometimes compensatory replacement of species by non-native species, but there are also some systems that I certainly am aware of that have just become so heavily degraded that there's just simply a loss of species. So I think it's hard to give a broad generalization on that.
Kind of an observation, I think Hank suggested many months ago that your report talk about things scientific, and I just want to say that I find that first of all, I think it's a high compliment to you that you're invited to conferences, particularly the one of 12 scientists selected worldwide to talk about these issues, and the fact that you're able still to do that and provide us the benefit of that analysis seems to me really important, and I appreciate it. And the other thing is, this stuff is interesting, and you're giving us information, and you references to articles between meetings, and that to me is very important, and I urge you to keep it up. I think it's very valuable. But the last thing, I'm sorry, Joe.
I was going to mention that maybe not everyone is aware, but Cliff's term as lead scientist is close to expiring, and he's agreed to stay on a temporary part-time basis while we go through the process of selecting a new lead scientist. But I do want the council members to know that we've been extremely fortunate to have him here with us for the last, has it been 3 years now?
A little more than 3 years now. It's supposed to have only been 2.
I know.
There was one thing notably absent from your report: the adventures of the chair of the Independent Science Board recently in the Colorado River.
Oh, I forgot to mention that. Dick Norgard was, on a 3-week rafting trip, I believe, down the Colorado River, and
Yes.
He was about 2 weeks into it, 13th day into it, and he had a fall during a hike and broke his ankle, and he had to be helicopter evacuated out of the Grand Canyon.
Now, some, and the slightly evil sense of humor from the science program included photographs of his injury, his wounded leg, his helicopter rescue in the middle of the river, which would be available for any of you who'd care to do it. So Dr. Norgard was actually pretending he was 25 years old again. Is that correct? Climbing rocks?
Dr. Norgard has 2 young, rather rapidly growing twin boys that I think he tries to keep up with, and maybe that was part of the problem.
Okay. Cliff, thank you very much.
Thank you, Cliff. Very well done.
Okay, members, let's go, please, if we could, to item number 6, which is the meeting minutes. You'll recall we had some problems with the meeting minutes of a couple of ones last time, and wanted to make sure that we got them correct this time. Are there comments on the revised minutes for the 3 meetings in question? Are there comments? Okay, I have some comments. Pat, Chris, just notation on, let's see if I can find my notes here. On the meeting of July 29th, 2011, the draft meetings, the discussion starting item number 11, and this is where members like Mr. Nordhoff wish to record a vote and so on. I just noticed that for example, on page number 8, prior to the lunch recess, Member Gray indicated she should be unable to attend the remainder of the meeting, therefore cast an aye vote on the pending motion. I know that you can read that, but normally what we do when a vote is cast is we actually show the vote cast. And the reason for that is when you come around at the end, you do say 7-0 on these kinds of items, but I think you've got to Chris, just take a look at that section. I'm not, I want to approve the minutes. I want to just make sure it's correctly written, accurately reflects what we did.
Seeing that I wrote that,
well,
I hope that it's relatively
I withdraw
accurate.
my confusion.
No. If you have, do you have some word changes that you suggest, or
normally when
tally?
we record a vote,
Uh-huh.
it's vote taken, summary, vote cast. And in this case, we mention in the text, cast and I vote on. But we
Right.
do not have the summary of the vote actually cast. Look, a fair reading of all of this stuff would show what we actually did.
Okay.
But just try to, I think we need to standardize the format on these kinds of things.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Any other questions on any of the minutes? Is there a motion?
So moved.
Mr. Natoli, second. Mr. Nordhoff, starting with Mr. Nordhoff, call the roll.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Totally aye.
Okay, for all three sets of minutes approved. And now, Joe, we're a little ahead of schedule, which is both surprising and good. But we now are at file number 7, the EBMUD issue and levy reimbursement. Are the folks here? Are they all here? Dante? Yeah, okay. If everyone's here and we're prepared to go, and Mr. Nickel, I know you're here, why don't you all come forward if you would, please, and let's go through the process. This is file item 7. File item 7. And folks, I think all of you have been here before. You'd have to press the little button to get the microphone on, and because we're broadcasting this on simulcast, if you could draw the microphone close to you when you speak, that would be appreciated. That more easily picks up the sound system. So, Mr. Nickel, why don't you summarize this issue, if you would, please?
Yes, thank you. And just quickly speaking on behalf of staff, we were unaware of the moose term.
But you fully intend to utilize it from this point on?
Well, sure. I think we've looked into some terms, but I don't recall moose being the animal that's been referred to for management.
Okay.
So anyway, this item is relating to the Delta Aqueduct protection projects, and so just briefly relating to the statute that set up this project. Several years ago, the legislature passed SB X21, I believe it is, and this bill was allocating funding for projects that repair and reinforce levees for aqueducts that cross the Delta. And I believe this was the 2008 Disaster Preparedness and Flood Prevention Bond Act. And essentially what that has led to is it led to DWR putting out a PSP, I believe project solicitation package, and trying to find and identify those projects that help meet the statutory criteria. And so they did that in early 2010 and identified 10 projects that would meet the criteria for repairing and reinforcing those levees that protect water supply aqueducts crossing the Delta. And I believe the projects cover the 5 islands that the McCollum Aqueduct crosses. I believe that's Lower Roberts, Upper and Lower Jones Tract, and Palm and Orwood tracts. And so from that time, the 10 projects rather were reviewed by DWR. They did initial assessment, and then if you may recall, in May of 2010, the project proponents approached this council and provided a summary of the projects and were looking for approval of the funding. And if I might step back a little bit, the statute also states that this body, or the California Bay Delta Authority or its successor, which is you folks, is also required to grant its approval for the funding to be released for these projects. And I believe it was approximately $35 million. And so both DWR and the Stewardship Council are responsible agencies under CEQA. And so at the time, the project proponents approached you folks, and it was determined that the full projects were not yet fleshed out, but this council approved funding for the design and planning and review process, environmental review processes. And so subsequent to that, the project proponents went back, conducted more development of the scopes of work, the CEQA review, and the various CEQA review processes. And So what they are coming back to us now, or coming back to you folks now, is with 5 of the 10 projects. And 5 of the 10 have been sufficiently developed, and they will likely approach the council once more with the second 5 once they have conducted the remainder of their review. And so basically, what I want to just briefly cover with you folks today is what we've received and reviewed for our internal staff review and what we're putting before you folks for an approval. And then also to just highlight briefly the other work that's been done by the other agencies. And so basically, I think the main pieces that we've reviewed as staff were the scopes of work, the CEQA determinations, and the concurrences developed by the other agencies. And so prior to coming to us, the proponents worked with the Department of Water Resources and provided them detailed information on the specific work projects that they were going to put together, the scopes of work. They provided background on the CEQA review that they had done, and that included some third-party biological assessments and reviews by consultants. And they filed notices of exemption, and the Department of Water Resources has reviewed and concurred with their scopes of work and their CEQA determinations. And I believe the CEQA determinations are essentially categorical exemptions for this type of work, which is primarily repair and reinforcement of existing levees. And I'm sorry I didn't mention this earlier, but folks from East Bay Mud, Eileen White with East Bay Mud, Dante Nomalini with Central Delta Water Agency, and Gail Newton with DWR are here to answer any of the more detailed questions that you folks might have, as well as any questions on the review processes that they undertook.
Okay. Mr. Nomalini, my recollection is you represent all 5 of the districts in question today.
I'm here on behalf of all 5. Richard Johnson is Secretary and Counsel for 2039 Upper Jones, but I'm authorized to speak on his behalf. He was planning to get here later today, but I'm authorized to speak now.
Great. Okay, Ms. Newton.
I was helping Dante there, yes. I wasn't going to provide a presentation. I was just going to be here to answer questions should they arise.
Randy.
The only question I had as I reviewed the information and I checked with staff, I think I've received the answer. And that is, subsequent to our last conversation about these projects, the Delta Plan has included a lower San Joaquin floodplain planning scope. I just wanted to make sure that the investments in these levees on the identified islands would not be in conflict potentially with an area that may be targeted for floodplain management.
May I address that?
Yes, please.
I don't know of any scope of a plan that would affect these districts in that area. That focus was on the confluence of the San Joaquin and Old River. It's farther upstream. That plan, however, is not well along. It's supposed to be in some form by 2012, but we haven't seen any detail on it. But I don't know of any planning that would affect these particular districts in any kind of a floodplain.
The item that triggered the question was, I recall from the Dreams 1 study, Roberts Island, one of the Roberts Islands was mentioned as potentially, and just wanted to make sure that we weren't running into a conflict.
That's Upper Roberts. The one we're dealing with is Lower Roberts. There's a Middle Roberts in between.
Good. Thanks.
Let's see, Hank, and then Mr. Nichol for a comment.
2 questions. The first is, what would likely happen if this investment were not made? And the second question, in the absence of the aqueducts, would the levees be repaired?
Well, I can address some of it. In the absence of the project, I don't know what would happen. The flood risk certainly will be reduced if we complete the projects. The projects also include some habitat enhancement features, and so those benefits would not be derived. What was the second question?
Well, actually, I think that was the second question.
Oh, what's the first one?
If there is a flood and the levees fall down, or the dikes fall down, what happens to the aqueduct?
We restored them twice in the Jones Tract area before. That happens to be an area with significant infrastructure, not only the aqueducts of East Bay Mud, but we've got a major railroad, we've got a major fuel transmission line going through there. We have Highway 4 that is affected if there is a levee failure. And then we have the clear evidence from past failures of the impacts on adjoining islands and resources. So I think it would be clear, although there's some dispute over that, at least with the former director of the Department of Water Resources, as to whether or not you should automatically resuscitate. But in my opinion, they would be resuscitated.
But if the repairs are not made and there is a flood and the levees are breached, would it be a temporary interruption of flow of the water? Would it be more permanent than that? I mean, the water level versus the river level?
And it depends on the failure. You know, we experienced a failure in 2004, and as far as East Bay Mud's aqueducts, they were submerged. They experienced corrosion. As a result of that, we were able to continue water supply. But I think this goes beyond East Bay Mud's water supply. It goes to, you could have potential progressive levee failures, is what some of the scientists have predicted. And in that case, not only would you impact the other infrastructure, the Kinder Morgan gas line, State Highway 4, you would impact the ecosystems and potential saltwater intrusion. And then if you have progressive failures, which one of the scenarios looks at, then you could even have impacts down as far as Clifton Court Forebay and impact the water supply to the 20 million people in Southern California that depend on it. So the impacts are great. I want to answer your second question as far as...
Could I stay with the first one for a second? So when the aqueduct was flooded, I mean, did that interrupt water flow to the south?
It did not, because at that point it was an isolated failure at Jones Tract, but had there been progressive ones, it would take progressive levee failures, and there's scenarios that predict that could happen that would impact the water supply to 20 million. The Jones Tract...
But just the fact that it's, and again, I don't know the background on all this, but if the water level of the river is equal to the water level at the top of the aqueduct, wouldn't it continue to flow, or would it just stop? I mean, at some point, would the output at the end of it be the same?
Are you talking about East Bay Mud's aqueduct or the water to Southern
East Bay Mud.
East Bay Mud's aqueduct, it can go for a period of time, and it has in the past, being submerged, so the water continues to flow. It's
Okay.
you know it's an enclosed pipe. So when we experienced a Jones Tract failure, it did not impact the water supply to our customers.
Okay.
And then I did want to expand a little bit on your second question, as far as what if this funding isn't approved today, will the improvements be made? And I just want to remind you that there's multiple beneficiaries to these projects beyond East Bay Mud. There's Kinder Morgan, there's the gas lines, there's the WAPA lines, State Highway 4, all the ecosystems in the Delta, potentially the water supply to 20 million people in California. And if this funding's not approved today, I don't see who is going to pay for these improvements, because right now, the DWR has approved 85% state share. The only agency that has come forward with the local share is East Bay Mud. East Bay Mud has historically been the only ones that has invested in the levees. And we have agreed and entered into agreements with the reclamation districts to pay the local share, which is 15%. And in addition, we have agreed to cash flow the projects, because there's only a certain advancement they get from the state. So we've made a commitment, but that's as far as our commitment goes, and we are the only agency doing that.
But all the other facilities affected would be in favor of this, obviously.
Oh, definitely.
They can't bankroll it.
They haven't come to the table to bankroll it.
You'll recall that this has actually led in our financing section to recommendations, for example, for utilities regulated by the Public Utilities Commission in California, that they immediately be directed to provide money for a higher level of protection for existing infrastructure, that a fee assessment process start at the PUC to assess their reasonable share of the protection they currently receive. And this is kind of an illustration of that discussion. But beyond that is a much more complicated question of, the state of California acknowledges there is a state interest in the Delta. The legislation under which we exist declares part of that to be infrastructure, but it's undefined. It's kind of like how much water does area of origin law give you the right to? Well, nobody knows. How much state obligation to spend exists? There's a process underway. The Flood Board is supposed to make some recommendations. The Department of Water Resources is supposed to eventually identify the state interest. But that draws us into the discussion of who pays how much for what, and it should surprise no one that everyone's in favor of themselves paying the smallest amount and everyone else paying the largest amount, and that is true of all the players in the puzzle. And in some way, the irony of this situation is ABMUD, which is responsibly acting because their pipe is affected, is what we call a real party in interest, although that's not the way you phrase it in these works. But the reclamation districts, which do not have the financial base to do this, are also the agencies which are guaranteeing to hold the state harmless from any problems in this, an irony that cannot escape the attention of anyone who reads it. I mean, it's really, this is an exemplar of the deepest kind of dilemma of mixed uses and mixed ownerships and mixed responsibilities and mixed economic capacity. And the Delta is full of illustrations like it. It's very interesting. Sure. We've got to get Don, then Mr. Nickel, come back to you, and then Dante will.
Just a couple questions. Well, I think just to the chair's last point, though, I mean, the local match, however it's arrived at, still for all, there's only 5 projects today, but for the 10 projects, it's about $6 million that the locals need to come up with in order to match the 40+ million for the state and other, I guess it's the state funds that we're talking about here. My question is then, for the work that's being proposed here, it will be PL 8499 work, slope, seepage, and then some vegetation restoration. Is that the?
That's correct.
That's correct.
Okay, and I'm curious about, because we've had this discussion, in fact, with our legal intern report this morning about the Corps' policy regarding vegetation, and I assume obviously replacement and/or if there's some mitigation required as a part of this. Are you able to do waterside plantings, or you have to bench them? Or
we're staying up above the ordinary high water mark with our planting. These are not project levies, right. So the Corps technical letter does not apply. We're complying and working very closely with the Department of Fish and Game and Department of Water Resources. Their programs that provide these funds have as important features environmental enhancement. So the levee section in the areas of the environmental enhancement is widened. We may meet the letter of a Corps application, although the Corps technical letter isn't designed for this type of letter, but we're going to set back 20 feet. We're trying to pick the type of vegetation, a very large tree wouldn't be appropriate. So it's somewhat dancing on the edge, but we're staying away from the Corps with our area of work.
Okay. Gail, I didn't know you give her.
Maybe I can speak to it a little bit. On average, each of these 5 projects is creating about 2,000 linear feet of waterside vegetation. It will be, exactly what that is will be determined by how much they can move into the waterside area and at what level the tide is. And a lot of that is determined as we move forward with the projects, and we have Fish and Game's full concurrence and help on this. So that'll be determined as to exactly what it is. And the best case scenario is that these 5 projects will create about 10,000 linear feet of new habitat, which is pretty tremendous for the Delta. And no, this would, under our current understanding of what the Corps' ETL is, the engineering technical letter, and even using their PGL, their policy guidance letter for a variance, these will not be compliant with what the Corps is currently proposing.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate
and
your
comments.
And they're
non-project.
Yeah, because it just, in my view, it points more to the absurdity, not, getting beyond this general safety concern about vegetation on levees, of how you treat areas in the Delta, and certainly throughout California. And I appreciate your
Absurdity is your word.
Yeah, that's my word. I mean, I can use that. I mean, I sit on the Safeco board, and we've responded, and I say absurd in the sense that if you want to have all the levees denuded, in California, in order to meet some regulation that comes out of Washington D.C., then that may be the goal. On the other hand, if you want to have some reasonableness about habitat and all the other functions that levees serve, including protection and reduction of risk, protection for facilities and people and the like, then I think that people need to be reasonable. And the variance process, in my view, is one that it is burdensome and it is difficult, and I think it's just another government runaround in some cases. So, at any rate, I think that well vetted these projects. I guess my last question would be: is the completion date is 2013? Is that so? This is going to be a 2-year effort. You'll do a lot of the work this year or next year?
We expect, if your board grants approval, that we could start work on these 5 by mid-September. We're ready to go. The second 5, we're not complete on our environmental assessments. We expect to complete that within 4 to 6 weeks, hopefully come back to you. And those projects would probably fall clearly into the following year, with completion by the end of 2013.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you can get the window of work opportunity, assuming.
Well, there are windows.
Yeah.
There are environmental concerns with regard to when you work, and if a bird lands in the nearby tree or something, we work around that too.
Okay. Thanks.
Ms. Newton, just let me go back to a question Mr. Fiorini asked earlier. You're familiar with the language we've got in our draft Delta plan about the South San Joaquin flood bypass, and it was based upon the DWR partnership with various other public and private agencies and definition. And it's your view also this does not conflict with that floodplain designation? These projects, these projects do not conflict with that.
That's true, Phil. These projects don't conflict with what's going on with the South Delta planning. And in addition, there is a new work group I think you're probably aware of that John Kane is the technical lead on. And my staff are involved in that as well. Both my staff that are working on the conservation strategy for the whole Central Valley, as well as my Delta Levee staff. So there isn't a conflict, and my staff are right there should there be any discussion on that matter.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, if I could,
yes,
I had one other question, just about the language that relates to liability. I mean, there's lots of discussion about that. Is everybody in agreement with the language? I know it's been vetted by DWR, by obviously districts are familiar with it. So.
We are in accord. We talked to DWR. We expect if your approval comes forward, we will amend our funding agreements to incorporate the language suggested by your staff.
And we are in agreement as well, and we will modify.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm not going to object, although the fact is the real party of interest is not promising to hold the state harmless. Correct?
We are only providing the local share and cash flowing, and we're providing financial oversight. These agreements for the levee improvements
between the reclamation districts and the state.
DWR.
Okay, so I'll interpret that as a yes. And the irony of situations where the only financially capable party at interest is providing the money because the reclamation districts can't, just financial difficulty, but the state's potential exposure, and I confess I am concerned with paternal-like liability, is out there, suggests to me that it's the real party in interest are going to have to step up on that kind of representation, if not here, and I'm not insisting on it here, in the future. It's impossible to contemplate that the state is protected unless we want to wind up owning all 5 tracts of land if there's litigation and they can't pay us back, which I don't think you want to. I just make that as a note. Normally, the reimbursement, the hold harmless language is backed up by financial capacity, but for a host of reasons, historically, we have not insisted on that in these situations.
Well, there's a broad dilemma. The state probably has exposure to liability. The state is electing not to go forward and actively do the work to increase their exposure to liability. I mean, we have no objection to the state coming down and doing the work if they want to do it.
But
we've got state interests at stake, a need that most would recognize is something that the state has enough interest in to fulfill.
Well, as with so many other things, there are overlays of many things, but at the heart of this issue is money and who pays. That's the heart of the issue. And as it is in so much of government. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary.
Yeah, we can't turn the turnip into something better.
You can't?
Cannot.
I've heard you give speeches saying you could.
Well,
silk purses,
maybe
sow's ears.
Not in this context.
Joe.
I just wanted to say, these parties have been before us a couple times before, and the council was fairly tough, I think, in setting standards and making requirements in order for these projects to move ahead. And I think in the case of the reclamation districts of East Bay Mud and DWR, all of those agencies have acted responsibly and really in face of difficult criticism, figured out what they needed to do, and I appreciate that. They've been very professional, and I want to acknowledge that publicly, that in the face of all of that, they came back and did what they really needed to do, and I think these are the right projects, and I think the council should support moving ahead with these projects with approval.
Okay, Hank, you had a question?
Yeah, one final question, if I may. How was the decision made about the repair itself? How are you going to repair it? Where are you going to put it? Are these controversial things, or is anybody walking along the levee with
They're not controversial. It's pretty obvious from the structural sections what needs to be added. There is a good, well, we use it as a standard, the PL 84-99 core standard, that sets up the parameters for the levee geometry based on depth of peak in the area, and it has some engineering behind it through the Corps. Has been in place for a number of years. It's a subject that you're going to deal with. It's the standard that the reclamation districts have been working towards. So it's simply a matter of picking the areas that need to be supplemented. There's some local recognition of areas as a general feel as to what, those areas closer to the aqueducts. And going back to your previous question, in 1980, the aqueduct, East Bay Mud Aqueduct Foundation was affected by the rush of water flowing through a secondary break in the railroad embankment. So if breaks occurred near the aqueduct, the erosion area could undermine the foundational structure. There are 3 aqueducts. The more modern one has a deeper piling foundation. So there is some more direct. In 2004, it only affected the coating.
Dante, the people you use, are they in-house engineers?
We have the local engineers that are there. DWR makes a review, but we're relying on our local engineering talent to pick. But we're using the format of design as being the PL 84-99 core template.
Maybe I can add something there, is that the rec districts did something that was kind of new, I think, for these rec districts, which is not only do they have an engineering firm that will be doing the work, but they also hired yet another engineering firm to do construction management, project management for that, to make sure that everything moves forward correctly. That's
Thank you.
Going the extra mile.
Okay. Other questions, Don?
No, I'm prepared to move.
All right, before we go to audience...
Could I ask
I'm sorry, Cliff,
question?
excuse me.
This is probably mostly to Gail. You have a significant amount of habitat enhancement built into some of these actions. Could you tell me how the effectiveness of these actions are going to be evaluated?
Well, we have in water code for this is a local assistance program, and in our water code for this program, we have the requirement for net enhancement. So we typically try to do that where it's feasible with these projects. Once the project is implemented and both Fish and Game staff and my biological staff have looked at it, then there always is a post-construction monitoring. Typically that's 3 to 5 years. I don't specifically know what it is on these projects right now. And then that becomes that habitat then is part of our programmatic habitat review. And we don't review every project all the time, but we are trying right now to go back and look at projects and monitor them and see if they're fulfilling the standards that were put in forth when they were implemented, which, by the way, as you might know, vary widely based upon whether they were implemented 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 1 year ago.
Just to point out, and I think you know this too, that very many projects that are habitat restoration or enhancement never get monitored whatsoever. And so I just wanted to be sure that there was going to be some follow-up on this.
No, we do.
In addition to the habitat enhancement that we've incorporated in the project, we have the program, no net loss and improvement of habitat aspect. So all the potential impacts on existing vegetation are being measured and will be measured by Fish and Game at the end of the project. And then we have a multiplier that's applied to those for which we will be buying, the project will be buying mitigation for those aspects. So we have the program effort to maintain a net improvement in habitat in the Delta, and that's overlaid by specific features in this project that are intended to bring us enhancement. But I think we'll be able to tell Fish and Game constantly monitors the vegetation, and that's what this is to promote that shaded riverine aquatic vegetation. And with Google and everything else we all use, it's pretty carefully monitored as to what the baseline was and where we will be on down the line.
Yeah, it sounds like you're covering the vegetation well, but of course the ultimate probably test is whether it's having a positive effect on some of the fish communities there.
I don't know of any effort that we're undertaking that would address that aspect. We're trying to get shaded riverine aquatic habitat. Whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, that's what's desired.
Ms. Newton?
That's it.
I was just going to acknowledge that my programs do not monitor population of fish species throughout the Delta. That's beyond the scope of what we do. But there are programs, as you know, in the Delta that do look at population responses.
Okay. Oh, Hank.
I lied before. One final question. If you were to be forced to pay the full cost of the levee repair, would you do that?
The districts couldn't afford it. We've got an agricultural base. The economics would not support it. We wouldn't do the project.
Okay. All right. Mr. Nickel, we're going to wind up with you, then go to the audience for any comments that might be around.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to basically wrap up that staff has reviewed all of the pertinent material, the scopes of work, the CEQA materials provided by the project proponents, the indemnification issue, the cost-sharing issue, and basically our findings are that we concur with the materials and determinations provided by Department of Water Resources, and we believe these projects meet the statutory criteria for funding and recommend the Council approve this.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, members and in the audience, anyone in the audience like to speak on file item number 7? File item number 7. No request to speak? Okay, what's the pleasure of the Council?
I'd move the staff recommendation.
Mr. Natoli moves. There a second? Second, Mr. Johnston. Starting with Mr. Nordhoff, let's call the roll. Eisenberg, aye.
Natoli, aye.
Natoli. Okay, we have 4 yeses. It passes. Mr. Fiorini stepped out for a minute. He'll be able to record a vote when he returns, so we'll keep the roll open for that purpose. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, Mr. Grindstaff, let's move ahead now to file item number 8. File item number 8, this is Delta Plan implementation, contract modification, and so on.
Mr. Chair, as you know, we've been doing a lot of work on the Delta Plan. As part of getting the Delta Plan approved, we have to do an economic analysis under the Administrative Procedures Act, and we've evaluated what we need to do in order to bring the plan to completion. We estimate that we need to amend the contract in the amount of $3.5 million. You can see there's some detail here of what the task orders are.
I want to make clear, we are not increasing our
not
budget
going beyond our
by
budget.
this. This
We
is
are not.
within the,
It's within the budget
funds that have been given to
significantly.
us for this Delta plan process.
That's
right?
correct.
Okay.
That is correct. So we're under budget. We expect this actually brings us to completion. We expect that it leaves us some additional funding that may be necessary if, for example, we had to recirculate or take other actions if we needed to as we move further into the process. But if we just proceed straight through the process, then we would actually have funds that would be unexpended and returned, I assume, to the Treasury. So that's where we're at now. And actually, the staff people, the two staff people that I would normally have here talking about the details, Kayvon Samsam had a baby girl and is at home with his wife. Well, his wife had a baby girl, and he is home with her, and so he's not able to be here today. And Terry McCauley was unable to be here today, but we actually have representatives of the contractor, and if you have questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Okay. All right. Well, let's see. Council members on this file item number 8, I know you've had a chance to take a look at it. Are there any questions? Pat, did you? Nope. Okay. All right, no questions. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak to file item agenda 8? 8? Delta Plan amendments. Okay. What's the pleasure of the council? Move, Mr. Johnston. Second. Mr. Natoli. Call the roll, starting with Mr. Nordhoff, please.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Totally aye.
Okay, it's a 5-0. And Mr. Fiorini, returning to the previous item, we took a vote in your absence to approve the levy subject to the conditions outlined in the staff report. Did you wish to add on to that?
I would have voted in favor of it.
Well, you're about now to be given the opportunity to actually vote in favor of it if you like.
Fiorini, aye.
Okay, so on file item number 7, it's 5-0 with Mr. Fiorini's vote added. On file item 8, it's 5-0. As indicated previously. Okay. Now, Joe, we're actually moving faster. I don't know, have you put something in the water that we're drinking? The bottled water has been doped to make us move faster?
I'm tempted to make a smart aleck remark. I will not.
I revealed earlier the staff has nicknames for some of us, and I have learned Mr. Grindstaff's nickname, and they call him Moose Grindstaff. Okay. Do you think, can we then proceed ahead to the Delta Plan
I believe
financing?
our panelists are all here, and we can proceed with that. And I'll ask Alan Highstreet to come up and introduce everyone. And,
okay. Great. Am I correct that this is not an action item?
That is correct. It was
okay. The agenda suggested we were somehow going to adopt it, but it is not an action item. It is an information item. Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay. Joe, do you want to introduce this, or would it be Alan, or how do you want to handle it?
I'll go ahead and let Alan talk. I'll introduce it in the sense that I want to say that in the Delta Plan, we have not spent a lot of time on the finance part of the plan, but my view is without financing, it all falls apart. And it would become, if we cannot, as a state, resolve some of the financial issues, then we will repeat history and put one more plan on the shelf that doesn't get implemented and fails. So finance is, in my view, really, really important. And with that, I'll let Alan start.
Okay, Mr. Highstreet.
Thank you. You're right on the timing. I actually told my panel to be here at 11, so... So actually, Richard Sykes is, I hope, joins us here in the next few minutes. But when we talked about putting the finance plan together, what I was shooting for was trying to get some experts that have written on the subject recently, to have them here So in the group we have right here, sitting to my left, is Ellen Hannock. She's a senior policy fellow with the Public Policy Institute, and she specializes in water and flood policy and infrastructure finance. So she's able to join us. We've also got James Knockbauer with the Legislative Analyst's Office, and he's also specialized in public finance, and he had a recent paper he put out on options for funding activities with water-related public purposes. And then we've got Dave Bolin, who's with Aqua, a senior regulatory advocate, and he's also a key member of the Water Plant Finance Caucus. And then Richard Sykes, when he joins us, we actually talked to Doug Wallace, who really wanted to be on this panel, but it turns out this is his vacation this week. So Richard Sykes has agreed to sit in, and when he gets here, we'll stick him up here.
Representing Ebbund.
So we can kind of keep this somewhat free-flowing. I've got a list of possible questions I think you might have in front of you. I've asked each of the speakers to just introduce themselves and kind of in general talk what they've done just for a minute or two to kind of set the stage, and then we can go through some of the questions I've prepared, or if you have specific ones, we'll just play it by ear. So Ellen, you want to introduce yourself to the group?
Ms. Hannock.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to Good morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you. Those of you who are familiar with my work know that a lot of what we talk about when we talk about financing is weaning the water sector from reliance on general obligation bonds, because we don't think that that's a sustainable use, a source of funds for a lot of the things that we've been lucky in California to have been able to use them for over the last decade. So I was pleased to see that the draft Delta plan kind of recognizes that also. It's great if there's a possibility to get some general obligation funding towards some of the things happening that are going to be happening in the Delta. For example, I think of the $11 billion bond proposal that's slated to be on the ballot next year, if there were one component of it that I would say is really hard to replace, it's the $3 billion for Delta ecosystem work, just because we don't really have mechanisms in place right now to address that. And I think that the way the plan tries to address that by saying, let's think about not just sort of go beyond the beneficiary pays idea, which in some ways everybody can agree with, but it's not been very operational to think about stressor pays principle for this. And I would suggest that in terms of looking at those two principles, beneficiary pays and stressor pays, the way to approach it from a practical standpoint so that you're not double counting is to think of beneficiaries as paying for the kind of infrastructure investments that will improve the services available to them. So you can think about that for flood control, think about that for water infrastructure, think about that for things like infrastructure corridors that might be a way of long-term sustainably managing some infrastructure in the Delta. So that's the beneficiary side. And then I would think of the stressor side as all of the various water and land users as well as dischargers in paying for redressing basically the damages to the ecosystem that have occurred, and also funding the governance structures. And the principle there is that to a large extent we haven't been charging ourselves as users of land and water and as dischargers into our pollutants into our water bodies. We haven't been charging ourselves as a society enough to cover the full costs, and that's really what redressing the ecosystem damages is about.
Thanks, Ellen. James?
Yeah, good morning, and thank you. I'm with the Legislative Analyst's Office. We were approached a couple months ago by a legislator who was interested in our opinion as to what the best way to raise money for a statewide public goods charge kind of thing would be. And so I worked on that project for some time, and we reached some options. And these are, of course, only if the legislature wanted to go down that route. We're not recommending necessarily that any such thing be implemented, but I can answer questions about that work or more broadly about water and governance issues.
Are we going to circle around to the question, if the legislature doesn't want to do anything, or if no one in California wants to pay themselves, what should be done for water and the ecosystem?
It's a very interesting question, and I think that's something the Water Plan Finance Caucus is also looking
I'll
at.
circle back to all of you on that question. Randy.
I don't know how in-depth you want to get right off the bat, but there has been some discussions about public benefits charges, and someone came before us and cited the provisions for electric utilities to the 2.85% public benefits charge, and it was suggesting that that's a model for water investments. However, on the utility side, the bulk of the deliveries are made by investor-owned utilities, whereas on the water side, it's mostly public agencies. But the public agencies that provide retail electricity have been able to reinvest their public funds locally and have not been subject to directives from the PUC. Can you comment a little bit about, through your studies, how you've determined what would be a fair application of a public goods charge, who would be responsible for collecting the money, and who would be responsible for determining how it would be spent?
Well, we looked at a lot of different options. We first looked at what people in other states do to raise money for water-related public purposes. The option we ended up coming up with was charging water retailers based either, if they're agricultural, based on the area they irrigate, or if they're not agricultural, based on the volume of water they provide. And these rates, I mean, that would leave a lot of policy choices, obviously. You could try to figure out which fraction of the money you'd try to raise on the ag side versus the non-ag side. You could determine what the rates are for each of those. You could determine whether or not the rates would be the same for each retailer in the state, or whether you'd want to give them credit for work they've done in the past or charge them more for extra stressors. So the basic framework is as I said, that we would suggest might be most workable would be to look at the water retailers as sort of the point of collection. They then would pass on increased charges to their customers.
Okay, that's the sources side. How about the uses? Where does that money go, and who determines how it would be spent?
We didn't really get into that as much. But because this, I mean, this is closely related to the beneficiary pays and stressor pays debates. The more aggressively you pursue beneficiaries and stressors, the less sort of general at-large funding you'll need. And you wouldn't want to raise money in this way so broadly if you were going to use it for very specific purposes that could better be approached with beneficiary pays or stressor pays.
So so your answer to Mr. Fiorini's question is, look, nobody wants to pay anything, but if you have a public goods charge, condition the receipt of funds, which would be almost everything locally, on the fact that they concede and legally bind themselves to either be a beneficiary or a stressor. Is that what you've said?
No.
Then say it again.
Just that as agencies try to figure out when to use broader-based funding sources versus more targeted ones like beneficiary pays or stressor pays, although beneficiary pays could be construed pretty broadly because there are some things we all benefit from, that the more that these broad public purposes are sort of by definition the ones that are hard to tie to specific actions or specific beneficiaries. And so that the better you tie stresses or beneficiaries to specific people or actions, the less need you'll have for this sort of general pot of money for other uses.
So you view the concept of beneficiary or stressor paying almost as an alternative to a public goods charge?
We would support they all be used potentially.
but the proportion of money to be raised by each would depend on the allocation of the scope of the public interest in...
Yeah, for each particular action to be funded, there could be a different cost share, for example. The state might pay 0%, the state might pay 100%, or somewhere in the middle, depending on the public portion, the public benefit portion of the total benefits produced by the activity.
Okay. Mr. Boland.
Yes. Sorry. I'm Dave Boland with the Association of California Water Agencies, and I kind of want to take a slightly different tack in terms of opening presentation and just pass out a statement here that we've got and make sure everybody
Staff
gets a
will
chance.
get the statement from you and pass it out. Just stay at the table.
Okay,
Our
great.
staff will pass it
Thanks.
out if you don't mind.
Yeah, what I'll do is just kind of use the statement as sort of the opening remarks part, and then we can get in the Q&A in a minute. First of all, we strongly support the implementation of the Delta Plan. But as you know, we've offered an alternative plan with this Ag-Urban Coalition, which is widely representative of users and beneficiaries throughout the state. We think that the comprehensive approach to supplying water and the co-equal values will be much better delivered in a plan that's a lot more collaborative than the one that we are facing in the fourth draft staff Delta Plan. Obviously, we're anxiously interested in seeing a fifth draft.
Monday.
But our comments are focused primarily on Chapter 9 in the fourth draft. Given the context of the fact that this plan is sort of up in the air at the present time, not finished, we think it's premature for any kind of focused discussion on the finance section of the fourth draft plan. But we do have some principles, and that's what these are that I've just passed out. And I'll just highlight those principles for you, and then we can go from there. The first principle that we want to go back to is the idea of creating value. We think that anybody who pays for this plan, however you label them, are going to need to see the value of the plan. And we think that that needs to be embedded in the plan itself. We specifically, as it regards the water industry, value is not necessarily perceived as a building up of a new regulatory bureaucracy or projecting authority into every aspect of water use management statewide. We don't see that as a valuable or necessary element. And although the fourth draft has a very wide view...
Do me a favor. Let's talk about the... We've heard extensively from Aqua and the Ag-Urban Coalition on your belief that there should be no regulation at all. I got that. But concentrate on finance, because everything Aqua supports costs money. And someone must pay the money for those things to be developed. So tell me about the Aqua principles of how to raise money for what you support.
We get to that.
Okay.
I think the key is that we need to support it, and it needs to be broadly supported by the people of California. Principle 2 is developing partnerships and broadening support. So that leads me right to that point. We think that not only do the water users, quotes, in the state derive benefit from this plan, but so do the people of the state in general, and so do many other sectors. And we are interested in seeing a broadening of the financial approach to incorporate those interests. And we do believe that in a more collaborative and partnership-based approach, that local governments could step in and then make the case to their constituents for paying whatever it takes to get the job done. And so that's the key, is figuring out what the job is to do and rationalizing that in such a way that the ratepayers at every level of government are bought in. And that we see as a potential hurdle with any kind of public goods charge. Implementing beneficiary pays appropriately is a fourth principle, and I'm going to focus on that quite a bit in my Q&A responses, because we really think it's time to quit the academic debate on beneficiary pays and put some flesh on the bones of some ideas about how to make it work. I really am encouraged by what I heard, particularly from the LAO's office, on understanding the difference between beneficiary pays, stressor pays, and a public goods charge in general terms. And I think that needs to be really unpacked. We need to really get at identifying solid value. We need to get at nexus, connections between the value and the costs. And we need to have a much more concrete plan in order to do that. So that gets back to the plan again. And then finally on support for the water bond, we think that that's an extremely important thing, and really encouraged that was mentioned as well by Ellen and others who have been trying to bring up the fact, and even though it is vaguely mentioned in the fourth draft that it exists, we think we need to underscore the fact that the legislature in 2009 passed that bond, passed it to put it on the ballot on a 2/3 vote, and that it needs to be taken seriously as a significant financial tool, and it needs to be unpacked in terms of what the chapters and the allocations are, and lined up with what the plan is intending to accomplish, and show how that money fits into the overall financial package. And until we if we preemptively presuppose, and this is where we'll have to disagree with Ellen, that it's dead on arrival or that the voters have not had their say yet, we really don't think that it's important, or we don't think that it's appropriate for the council to preemptively reject the possibility that bond will pass.
I'm sorry, have we rejected that?
Well, the way it's couched in your financial plan, and again, I think Ellen underscored the fact that they've moved beyond the idea of funding future water infrastructure with bonds as a policy position. And I think that's a premature...
Aqua's position is that general obligation revenue bonds from the state of California should be a major vehicle of moving into the future.
That's what you've said.
Okay, then
our position
tell
is
me
that
what Aqua says.
our position is that 2012 bond is a legislatively adopted and current, very detailed plan for delivering significant amounts of money to the purposes of the Delta plan, and it needs to be taken into consideration and addressed in the plan as a presupposed purpose, public purpose for funding. And it needs to be and it will be a significant stream for funding.
Pat? I heard Ellen say that the beneficiary pays principle is best applied to building infrastructure for water delivery, and that the stressor pays principle best describes contributions that would be made to restoring damage to the ecosystem. Could you comment on each of those?
Yes. First of all, again, I think it's our position that we need to get down to brass tacks about what beneficiary pays is. That this is a
actually, I was trying to take you seriously there. Ellen, I think, suggested that if you're going to create reservoirs or underground storage or improve levees or do a number of facility-related projects that have the effect of increasing water supply or assuring it to be more reliable. Does that fit beneficiary pays?
Yeah, I would think that's a benefit, very clear benefit. There are other benefits as well. And as far as the line between a stressor and beneficiary and the importance of not double counting, those are really important ideas that we need more attention to. And I think if we can see the benefits, if we can get a little bit better sense of what those benefits are, then clearly beneficiary pays is a principle we support.
And how about the stressor pays?
The stressor pays, again, just needs more definition at this point. And I guess, in our statement here, we touch on the fact that we are not supportive of a stressor pays authority granted to the Delta Stewardship Council at this time until we see more detail.
Well, how would you approach it?
Well, I think it's very clear that in either case we have some legal challenges that need to be addressed, and a lot of the water agencies have brought those up in previous epistles on the issue of public goods charge specifically, but also in terms of the stressor pays and beneficiary pays, there need to be some legal questions addressed first, and then I think there needs to be some kind of rigorous nexus-based approach to identifying stressors and measuring stressors and then allocating stressors by different sectors or by different participants. And that we haven't gotten to yet.
Okay. So are we talking about beneficiary, stressor, public goods, and bond? Are those the four financing approaches that?
Yeah, I actually, we talk about that in the statement as well. As a matter of fact, I appreciate the handout on Prop 50 and Prop 84, identifying ways that you can take those funds and dedicate those to specific purposes, either that are enumerated in those bonds or could be read into those bonds. And we think that the public sector in general, and then the first question was the role of public, particularly the state and the federal government, we think that we can take existing programs and plans and existing funding sources that are dedicated to doing aligned things with the Delta Plan and embrace those and develop those into the Delta Plan. And so I think that significant public funding exists, so it could be identified, and it needs to be identified as part of the Delta Plan finance package.
Wouldn't it be too limited a Delta Plan if we focused primarily on borrowed money, either in past bonds or the potential of future bonds?
Yeah, we're not suggesting
that doesn't create
bonds.
new money. It takes essentially money from the depleted general fund of the present and the future.
Yeah, we're not suggesting that bonds are by means, or the only means, or even the only part of a package by any means. It's part of a package. We appreciate the fact that you have a good diversity discussed in your chapter of all the different financing mechanisms.
So for James or Ellen, when you talk about a public goods charge, or you talked about it, but would you apply that to those general benefits that are presumed to accrue to all Californians, such as supporting the science program or other general activities of government to improve water quality in the supply, so the co-equal goals that are embedded in the law?
Well, we came up with a couple very broad categories within which we think most public purpose activities would fall. But within each of these categories and within each of these activities, whether it's increasing reliability or better science, you can always dig deeper and find sort of finer parsings of what's public and what's not public, or what's state and what's not state. And so the broad categories we came up with were the planning and efficient management of the statewide water system, broadening access to necessary water services, ecosystem.
Oh, wait. What is that one?
So that's beginning to get at sort of these, I guess, environmental justice type concerns, that there are some communities, for example, that just have really substandard water availability, and that it's, in some views, in the state's interest to be sure that there are sort of minimum standards statewide.
Well, see, that's where Dave might have a question, because virtually every general obligation bond that has anything to do with water has a ballot summary that starts with clean water. Because in polling, if you say you're delivering clean water, people vote yes. So if your category says some people have dirty water and a public goods charge is going to make it clean water, be hard to know what the parameters are of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you wouldn't want to put the state on the hook for supplying clean water to everyone everywhere at all times.
But in some way there's this argument that gets revisited every time there's a bond, that we are making water cleaner for the citizens of California. And if you say that's the purpose of a public goods charge, it could be very, very large, as everyone says our water could be cleaner if only we had some of this money.
I think the focus here was on the sort of the necessary water services, and not sort of on broad-based improvements, but on sort of targeted interventions that might potentially help particular communities that don't have adequate funding resources themselves. We wouldn't, I mean, water quality improvements are in many ways sort of a private improvement that the beneficiary should pay for.
Yes.
Maybe I'll just add a couple thoughts there. I think there's a lot of meeting of the minds between what the LAO has done on this and what the team that I've been working with is thinking about this. And we also advocated a public goods charge in our last big report that came out in February. I think there's been a lot of discussion in the state about a public goods charge in the months since then, in part because there's been a legislative proposal to look at that. So somebody's actually put some numbers on it and an initial hypothesis for how it would work. And so in that context, I've gotten questions sometimes about, okay, well, how big should it be? How much of it should go to the state versus the regions and so on? And I think it's useful to think about this as something that is potentially defined as bigger or smaller depending on how you're able to find alternative sources of funds for doing the things that you need to do. And you could say we already have 2 public goods charges, at least 2 that I know of in the state on water. One of them is Metropolitan Water District, which has been charging regional stewardship fee since the early 90s, which they use for a lot of the same purposes that the public goods charge on energy is used for. They use that within their region to support kind of good water management projects to kind of top
going
this up.
To meetings like this.
No, they actually it's for helping to fund things like water use efficiency, to wean them off the Delta and the Owens Valley. It's for things like recycling projects, topping those up, desal, and so on. That's what that funding goes for.
So they're management functions, but they're not constructing anything, and they're not buying water, for instance.
They're helping to it's basically a cost match for local agencies that are members of the regional network to make it more affordable for them to do things that are right now more expensive than buying state water project water, for example. So that's one thing that's been in place for a long time, and I think that's a component where one would like to see a public goods charge ideally targeted at the regional level where there's going to be a sort of benefit collectively for that region. The other one that's very interesting is Sonoma County Water Agency, which has I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly what they call it. It's a surcharge on every acre foot of water sold by the agency used to support ecosystem management. Used basically to support the investments and the science needed to address the biological opinions that they've got for particularly, I think, coho salmon on the Russian River. That was recently raised to, I think, now I want to say over $60 an acre foot. And
So would you say if you want to build something, you ought to use bond or other funds generated from some savings or some charge based on beneficiaries or stressors, and that if you want to plan or study or analyze or educate or communicate or otherwise manage, a public use charge might be more appropriate.
So I think there again it kind of depends. I mean, it makes a lot of sense for the planning of, suppose there an isolated facility of some sort for conveyance comes to be. The planning and design and all of that is part of the project cost. So that should be wrapped into
right. I agree. Yeah. But trying to figure out, we had a panel on East Bay mud, and the question was, if you do these project elements, will it improve the fisheries? And everybody said, well, we don't study that. We don't know. We're just told we got to have more, shade, so we're doing it.
Right.
But that other part has a has an interest beyond East Bay Mud or that reclamation district. It's an interest presumably of statewide significance.
Right. So that's an argument for why there needs to be better coordination of all of these activities that are trying to address ecosystem problems in the Delta and in the broader watershed. Because I think right now there's a legitimate frustration on the part of a lot of the different entities that are involved in mitigation of some sort or another, that they say they're already doing something and being asked to do more. There are probably a lot of ways in which we're very inefficient at the way we're using our resources right now on addressing the ecosystem because it's just too piecemeal. So one of the things that the team that I work with recently suggested in a blog that we posted last week on adaptive management was sort of the pooling of resources to manage those things in a way that doesn't take away everybody's power and autonomy, but in a way that does kind of force some real coordination and some pooling of resources to do that in a smart way so that somebody's not monitoring shade without also looking at the fish, for example, and without knowing about that particular example. Now, just to follow up on planning and data and analysis, there is one area where there's got to be some source of money that is beyond the watershed, and that is at the statewide level. And I've heard many water agencies, since the proposal for a public goods charge was formally launched, and the legislature say, well, we don't want to send any money to Sacramento, you never know what happens to it, unless everybody's view in the state is that there should just be an answering machine that says nobody's here at the Department of Water Resources. We've got to have some money to fund some of that basic oversight of what's going on with our water system, organizing the data. We can do a better job of that, but there's got to be some money for that. And traditionally, that's come out of the general fund. It started to come more and more out of bonds because our general fund is so strapped. The State Water Resources Control Board is essentially funded through user fees, permits, and regulatory fees, and we can, if we're not going to be able to get something sustainable out of the general fund, we've got to have a way for water users to pay for that, and a public goods charge, a component of that should go to the state for that.
Randy.
I've become very frustrated with the financing plan discussion. As one who has thought a lot about sources of funding, I agree with all of you, and I essentially agree with, these are the potential sources for funding. But what's frustrating to me is it's pretty hard to clarify the sources of funding until you identify the uses. And in a discussion with a panel last month, I suggested to Alan that it's time for a worksheet. It's time for a budget worksheet that lists by category the different types of financial activities that will be required in support of the co-equal goals. And I think it goes beyond, I think it's a budget that needs to include a comprehensive look at the amount of money that the state of California needs to invest now and into the future in support of the Delta Plan, which would include those portions of funding to other agencies that have ongoing activities. We have obviously a need for funding the governance portion. The fact that we exist suggests that there needs to be a way to pay for the science program and the Stewardship Council and the Delta Protection Commission and things like that. So that's a category on a budget worksheet. You've got facilities, either maintenance or improvements. That's another. You have issues like water quality, monitoring. If we make an investment in a habitat restoration project, there's got to be money available and a thoughtful process to monitor this investment and see if it's making sense. If we're truly going to have an adaptive management program, there needs to be funding for these ongoing monitoring and adjustment processes. Additionally, stressors. I'm a proponent of stressor pays, but we need to identify what those stressors are, what those stressors are contributing negatively to one of the co-equal goals, and then that needs to be a part of the budget process, a segment of the budget as to what each one, how each one would be dealt with. And I agree with Ellen. There's some aspects of stressor pays that are really hard to identify and maybe nearly impossible, but there are others that are pretty straightforward. And the part I like about that approach is that you can provide, actually through a fee or a whatever you want to call stressor pays, you can actually utilize that as an incentive to change behavior. And what better way to improve conditions than to encourage the reduction of bad behavior? And I've always used this example, and some don't like it, but because it's a simple one, it's effective. If unscreened diversions in the Delta are harmful to fish, then and if that is determined to be a stressor, then you apply a fee for that. But if someone chooses to make the investment and to screen that diversion, the fee goes away. So you have a funding source for a stressor, but when that funding source dries up, that means you no longer have that stressor. So that seems to be, that's the part I like about that. I agree with Dave, we need to identify truly who is a beneficiary, and ultimately that will vary a lot on operations. You take Sites Reservoir, for example. If its purpose is to allow Shasta to be reoperated for flood control purposes and to store water that can be released in dry years in support of the environment in the Delta, then it's entirely a public benefit. If it is a water storage facility to be utilized for agriculture in parts of the Sacramento or San Joaquin Valley, then the beneficiary looks differently. So as we go through this budget worksheet and we talk about the infrastructure investments, we need to have an eye towards how is that going to be operated. You know, if it's a reservoir, it depends on how it's operated as to whether or not this is the beneficiary or that's the beneficiary. So having said all of that, I would be curious to hear from each one of our panelists as to what you would include in a budget worksheet in terms of the uses of the funding.
Ms. Hannick.
You're looking at me, Randy.
Yeah.
I thought you had a great list right there. In terms of the types of activities that are going to be necessary, there's the basic governance structures that have been put into place, and there's and I would say including in that includes the facilitation. So, meetings are not always useless. I think a lot of times they're important, and to me, an important part of some of these new structures is to help coordinate out of what's a very disaggregated and disparate kind of institutional system that we've got. It includes a lot of the data work. It includes the science, and it includes the planning. And then there's facilities, and facilities are, obviously from a co-equal goals perspective, water movement is an important part of that, and water storage and the related aspects of that in the watershed. But there's also a lot of other infrastructure that one should be thinking about in this context. Roads are a big one, for example, sort of what happens with pipelines and all of that. A lot of which are as fragile in some ways as the water system to what happens with delta levees. Their facilities I include, levees and the related flood protection aspects of that. Investments and operations and maintenance. There is the whole sort of broad category of ecosystem investments and management, and that's something which goes well beyond. The science is going to have to be integrated in that in order to adaptively manage it, but there's also just going to be on the ground costs above and beyond the science, and water quality management, and that's sort of a pretty diverse basket, ranging from things like what we're doing with wastewater to what we're doing with a range of non-point sources. And I think when one's thinking about land it's important to think about land management as an aspect of the habitat, not just an aspect of flood management. The fact that the way we manage land in the Delta is also a stressor and something that's part of what we have to address.
I'm curious. Mr. Boland's statement said, let's get away from all the academic discussions of stressors and beneficiaries and fees and public benefit charges and get to something real. How do you get to something real, Mr. Boland? Maybe this is to you. Your alternative is an interest-based negotiation, as I understand it. I've never found interest-based negotiations about how much the interest groups pay to be all that productive. They strike me as, if not academic, they strike me as remarkably self-interested, which is similar to an academic discussion. Highly theoretical, but the bottom line is I want to pay the smallest amount possible, if anything. How do you get, give me an example of something that's worked in the water world, and how long did it take?
Boy, you've got a lot of questions there. The first one, I guess, in terms of what does this thing look like, Randy, I think, got at a first step, which would be a really important step. And actually, Ellen is trying to identify just intellectually what are we talking about and making a matrix of some sort, a list of these things, some cost ranges, some benefits, multiple benefits in many cases, and assigning some scale of value to those things, and then assigning some interest, some actual individual entities or types of entities that you can identify that will generate some interest. And building a database, essentially an analytical approach to your plan that translates it from general policy stuff to a list of stuff with price tags and with time frames and implementation. And I think you're moving that direction to some extent. BDCP's been doing a lot of that, and a lot of that, of course, could be leveraged into this process. The second question, just is this worthwhile to do it that way? I guess it would presuppose that you had some content basis to do it, and that's where it requires some investment of time and energy to identify what all we're talking about, what the parameters are. And there would have to be some straw proposals, and there would have to be some iterative processes. But I think you could do a lot by getting the interests to the table, by identifying what those things are and having them, basically buy in. And you would get that buy-in, I think, if you got down to some specifics.
Well, how do you prevent that from becoming what is typical in the legislature, which is the Christmas tree of preferred projects by areas around the state that add up collectively to, God knows, a lot of money, but not a plan, which is typically what happens.
That's been a theme here, is what is the boundary here, and how vague can we get? How much drinking water supply do we need to provide for every community that's struggling with poor quality, and at what level statewide? Do we go clear down to Imperial Valley? I don't know. I guess the point is that we do need some rational basis, and that's where this word nexus, and the attorneys need to probably get in on this a little bit, about justifying the boundaries of what it is that this plan is going to provide for the people of California. The other point that I wanted to get across, and we can get into, is the public interest. And you said it yourself. There's an enormous amount of the general public interest buried in this plan, and it needs to be implemented, and there needs to be money for it. Ellen mentioned the fact that we do need to administer the plan. We need to find money for it. Finding that money by trying to stick a small group of beneficiaries with the price is not going to work. What we propose is that, and what we would like to point out, is that this public interest needs to be defined pretty broadly, and it needs to be owned by the people of the state of California in its entirety, and not necessarily farmed off very quickly to a small group of potential water users who are also taxpayers but don't represent the entire state. There are state interests, and they need to be paid for by state sources of money.
Well, I mean, the draft Delta plan has a rough calculation. Mr. High Street, you were involved in calculating the amount of money currently being spent on an annual basis by various public entities, federal, state, and local, for water supplies in California. And I forgot to bring my copy of the plan, but my recollection is it's $20 billion a year for regular operations, maintenance, fees, and service, another 5 or 6 for capital construction that goes on, with the understanding that is simply a snapshot. It is not traditional. But the state portion of that overall share is how much?
The state portion, when you go through that, DWR for the one snapshot year we looked at, well, they had a lot of activity, was $7 billion of that.
And that was that the Prop 1E flood control money as part of that? I don't remember.
Yeah, so they had that.
So you had the big $5 billion spike on flood control.
And so then you also had state board that was less than $1 billion and the like. But the main thing is the local agencies are the major.
Well, then how about this as a principle? State of California presently pays 15% of the operational cost in the year study. That's the max of public contribution to water operations for the future. Local agencies presently spend X for their activities. That's their share. Feds, we can hope to drag them in. There's no way we can legislate them. Now, I could almost understand that approach because it jumps to the notion of cost sharing. But that isn't the way the agencies want to go because, I'm sorry, I'm a cynic. The goal is to get other people to pay for the desired activities to the greatest amount possible. And that's why the notion of another interest-based negotiation is, it seems to me, a guarantee for 4 years of protracted work and activity, but not much progress unless dynamic things change. And I don't see them changing without something like somebody being given authority to actually propose, establish, and set fees, whatever it is. Now, the problem is, from your client's viewpoint, they want to negotiate the fees in advance of giving anybody authority to set them. The typical device is you put a limit or a cap on fees in statute, forcing to go back, and if you're really concerned about it, you put a required 2/3 majority, or you put it on the Constitution that would require another vote of the people. But all that does is further lock up this revenue raising and revenue spending into a morass of confusion. Don't trust anyone enough to simplify the process, demand that the complex process that exists be simplified. How do you get out of that dilemma? And do you like the idea of 80% local costs because you're paying 80% of the money now to operate this big array of systems we've got?
Again, a lot of questions built into that statement. I guess the idea of using some kind of a sharing approach is kind of built into the spreadsheet, and I think that may have some merit. It's clear, though, from not just the Delta Plan process, but many processes in California, we need to do more and want to do more. So just sticking with the current deal may not be appropriate. Again, there's a lot of need for new efforts, new investments, and those need to be considered seriously as well.
Everybody knows what ought to be done. Get to the point where you can find a way to raise the revenue to do it. That's the dilemma on financing. It's not identifying the need. That's hard. It's very complex. It's not identifying the need. It's identifying through the complex array of public attitude, Prop 209, Prop 40, Prop 208, all of the other restrictions we've placed on ourselves to get to the point where what needs to be done, in part, if not in whole, can be done.
I would suggest we bring in another local agency voice at this point. We haven't gotten a chance.
They have vast reserves that they are prepared to pledge to these statewide activities. Mr. Sykes, glad you could come.
Thank you. Sorry, I was a little bit tardy. I think maybe one way to approach this is to start smaller. Some of the things that we think that are necessary is there needs to be funding for the DSC, and there needs to be funding for the science program, and there probably could be some agreement around how that gets funded. East Bay Mud does not has been independent of other water utilities in that we are open to the idea of whether it's a public benefits charge or a water fee. We do think that those two things are critical. The science program is what's going to tell us whether we're doing the right thing adaptively. And we don't want to make huge investments without having a good sense that the outcomes will benefit the delta. So, I mean, that may be one approach. Everything we've talked that I've heard so far, is on the wide range of potential funding sources. I think that it's going to be a mix, and I think that our position has been to the extent that these are the benefits are narrowly accrued, so should the beneficiary should pay. So I mean, you've heard, I believe, Doug Wallace talk about our projects or our projects with the County of Sacramento. We've essentially funded all of those. Those had a benefit in a drought year just for our company and or our customers, and in normal years for the County of Sacramento's customers. We're talking about something different, and drawing that line on the projects. I think virtually all the projects are going to have some regional benefit, some local benefit, and some statewide benefit. And how do we do that? That's maybe that's what we discuss. What's a process for taking, whether it's Sites Reservoir, and it's going to depend upon how it's operated. So we talked about two operating scenarios with two different sets of beneficiaries. How do we have that flexibility for the future if the beneficiaries change? Yes, it is complex. That's why that's why we're all here. It would have been fixed already if it wasn't.
Randy? Alan, you've heard the request for the budget worksheet last month, and just checking in now. How's that coming along at the staff level?
We are getting closer, but we're not there yet. As they go through the budgeting process, we're trying to nail that down a little bit. But I'm trying to get them project a few years out also to see what they might need as we go forward. So we're making some progress, but not as quickly as we would like.
Would it be appropriate to ask our panelists to provide offline their ideas for categories that should be included in that budget worksheet?
We certainly could do that.
I'd like to make that request.
The request has been made, and we would appreciate your offline comments to Alan that we can try to blend into, as Randy calls it, a worksheet? Worksheet. Okay. Pat? I want to circle back to the bond discussion. The bond was on the 2010 ballot, then it got continued, and my recollection is, without enthusiasm, Aqua supported the continuation. Most of the water community did, and at least the explanation, there were many explanations, but the private one to me was, we don't think it's going to pass in the midst of the recession, so let's put it off for 2 years. Now, I think that actually is a pretty practical-minded consideration. What's likely to happen with that same consideration? You guys are some of you are part of that discussion, or closer to it than we are. What's likely to happen on 2012, next year? What do you hear? Ellen?
I was going to say it depends a lot on the economy. I think, one of the very interesting things about general obligation bonds is that they have tended to be sold to the public as not increasing our taxes. And you can look at a lot of the...
Because it borrows money.
Well, right. But the way that you look at the voter materials, and most of the GO bonds that we've used for water and some other infrastructure over the last 15 years, look at the materials and you'll see that over half of them explicitly say this won't raise taxes. Well, in a situation of flush economy and, not sort of serious budget constraints at the state level, it's not, arguably it's not a completely false thing to say, because there's growth and it's just sort of a thing you can accommodate. Well, when you're facing tough budget times, and that's partly because of the economy and partly arguably because of a shift in people's willingness to think about new revenue sources or increasing revenue sources, you start to see the trade-offs. And it's not a coincidence, I think, that in 2010, the teachers' unions already went on record as against the water bond, saying, look, this is something that has some direct implications for other sectors. And, I think voters are going to hear that message in a way in tough times that they wouldn't hear it in other times. So, I don't have the crystal ball to say what the economy is going to be like in the fall of 2012. But
Mr. Knockbauer, what do you hear?
Well, unfortunately, I can't really speculate on.
Oh, come on! The LAO hears all the gossip. Come on, tell us what's going on.
Sorry.
Oh, what a fink. Okay, Mr. Sykes.
I'm going to plead Sergeant Schultz also.
Mr. Boland.
Me too. I will say, just kind of along the lines of the perceptions out there, I can share just generally that Aqua has been doing some work on polling about perceptions about water and value and conservation and are we still committed and so forth. And it's surprising the level of continued commitment statewide to the value of water and conservation and the positive, I guess the clean water message basically that was mentioned earlier that has to presuppose every bond. Clean water is important to Californians.
Okay, what do your polling show on willingness to pay money?
No comment at this point.
Well, that's the answer, and it is the dilemma we face, which is why the tone of that chapter was somewhat skeptical about the notion that there is a vast honeypot of money likely to be available in the near future, and that that's kind of my read on the situation, and I nothing in the news this year has convinced me to the contrary. It'll take at a minimum 5 years, maybe a decade, to work through these problems. But I'm not sure that we aren't going to face a series of funding restrictions, federal, state, and local, for a host of reasons that appeal to the public, regardless of ideology on programmatics and importance of issues and so on. And the dilemma you face then, what do you do then? What do you do then? I mean, the BDCP is, some people have argued, the last of the giant federal state water projects that's going to be completed that anybody can imagine. But what do you do then if you cannot see a funding stream for the array of things that are both legally, practically, and politically necessary to do some kind of conveyance, if you can't see a funding stream for those? Now, the answer is, well, do the facilities and we'll worry about the rest later, but that won't work, I don't think, in the year 2011 and forward. Might have worked before, but I don't think it works now. I don't know. It's a real dilemma.
Again, I think I go back to our number one principle in our statement, which is you need to create value. The people will pay if they believe there's value.
But what does that mean? Because the people who negotiate payment terms are administrators of water districts, trade associations, and elected officials of boards of directors of water agencies who pay contract for water. That's the starting point. And they are very specific. I want this amount of water, I want it this time, I want it this quality. And then the critics of that are on the environmental side, you have to do this and this. And everybody is sure of what they want. And they hope, in my view, by demanding everything they want, they hope that the eventual thing that might be gettable is at least closer to their original position than where they start. I don't know how you have an intelligent discussion in the old style about facilities and mitigation and so on in this atmosphere.
I think our elected board of directors sees a nexus between reliability of water supply and the health of the Delta. So that value is a Delta plan that stepwise appears to have the elements of success in improving the conditions in the Delta will improve our water supply reliability, and that is where it adds value. And that is, and that's where certainly in my mind, whether it's public benefits charge or water tax or whatever we call it, gains traction.
Yeah, I think value is a nice word to use, But I think in these economic conditions, we have to talk about need. If we need water in order to have a sustainable economy. Other states have better economic conditions, more friendlier governments to business than California does. If we couldn't assure by investing today that there will be a reliable water supply in the future, the exodus from California in a business sense to other states like Nevada and Arizona that do not have all the same problems is going to increase dramatically. I mean, in these times, you're talking triage. You're talking what funding do we need to spend? And when you're talking value, it's just doesn't have the same sense of urgency that I think we need to convince people that this is necessary.
Okay, Randy, then Pat.
Well, I would just question the panelists. When it comes to transportation needs in California, it's pretty evident if you live and work in Southern California that there's congestion. It seems that general public perception led to the $9 billion high-speed rail bond passing, which may lead to a quick trip from Chowchilla to Bakersfield someday soon.
By airplane?
But I think education should be a component of the Delta Plan, or at least we need to address how to educate the public. We have the Save the Water program that's identified in there that DWR operates and has been helpful. But what are your thoughts about how do we effectively communicate to the general population that turns on their tap every day and water comes out that we're in the midst of a crisis?
So I just would like to think, so Dave mentioned the polling that Aqua is doing, and it sounds like in part in relation to the bond, perhaps, and how people...
Actually, I should clarify the fact that question wasn't asked. So the reason I had no comment was because the polling was very specific on conservation and on people's willingness, basically, to value water in California.
Good. Okay, great. Because my reaction when I heard it was, okay, well, that could be useful for thinking about how people might vote on a general obligation bond and, help inform strategies for how Aqua and others might advertise and get the word out. But, that same information could be useful for water agencies to be getting the word out that there are things besides, that there are components that we're not paying for right now that we need to pay for in order to keep our system working. And it's not just about fixing the pipes under the roads leading up to the houses or fixing the treatment plants. It's also about covering some of those costs that have been neglected that are causing our ecosystems to crash and making it very difficult to move water around. And I think that right now the reaction of a lot of the water agencies has been, we've been able, that should be a general taxpayer thing, and as long as general taxpayer money is available, fine. But we're reaching a point where we realize we're not doing enough and part of that is organizing better to spend our dollars better, but we're also not finding that public money anymore as easily as we were. So now it's time to step up and get the word out. And I think education is key, and the local Californians trust their local governments more than they trust their state government, according to PPIC polling. And local water agencies are part of that local government. So that's my plug to you guys.
Well, and actually we're thinking along the same lines. We recognize the fact that local water agencies do have tremendous credibility with their constituency and are considered a reliable source for information on water. And as we know, during the drought process, we're teaming up with DWR to make sure we get the message out. And even with the governor's official declaration that we're not in a drought, we continue to work with DWR and independently as water agencies to assure our customers and the citizens, basically the voters of California, that we need a more reliable system, a more resilient system, a more sustainable system long term. So I don't doubt that we have a tremendous opportunity here for more education. It can be vested at all levels of government. whether or not you should build a line item into your budget spreadsheet for education about the importance of the Delta to the voters. I stay silent on that point, but education is important, and I think we need to make the case. Broader than just education, we need to make the case about what it is that needs to be done, and in the need sense, not what we'd like to do. And maybe it's going to be a longer process to, for instance, deal with legacy mercury in the Delta. It's going to be centuries, possibly, to get that done. Maybe we can't build a robust remediation program for dealing with mercury in the next 20 years. Maybe we can't afford to do that right now. Maybe that's not a priority. I'm just, I don't know. That's up to your science folks, and that's up to a lot of decision makers. But the point here is that we need to rationalize what it is we do need to do and what it's going to cost. And the citizens ultimately are going to pay the tab one way or the other.
Well, thanks to Keith, I think I actually now have the fourth draft in front of me, but I think I remembered it pretty clear. I'm more and more convinced after listening to you that the narrative of Finance Chapter number 9 is probably closer to reality than most things. I'm not asking you to agree with the recommendations, but the narrative is one that's somber about the possibility of free money. It is sober about the fact that there are immediate needs, and it plays to this notion, Joe, of staging. It leads to host of guiding principles, beneficiary, user, all the other stuff, but it also talks about immediate needs. It recognizes that BDCP, even if it's completed in 2 years, the estimate is still 10 to 15 years before you start turning dirt on a big project. So what do you do in the meantime to protect water reliability and ecosystem protection, the co-equal goals? And in the meantime, the narrative suggests it's the protect the existing conveyance system. I mean, it's nuts not to protect what you've got in some meaningful way and try to improve the Delta ecosystem. Suggests the need for strong science component fundings, because as we learn things we should do and things we shouldn't do. And then, the third and the least significant of this is the operational components of the Delta Plan, which is the ongoing funding for the Conservancy, the Delta Protection Commission, the Council, which is, in dollar terms, a tiny pimple on this whole puzzle. But it's also got, as best we know, the current estimates of BDCP, which is in the billions and billions of dollars, and no one disputes that. And I keep thinking, Joe, that the Delta Plan, the checklist that the worksheet that Randy's talking about, this notion of taking all of the near-term ideas, the immediate needs, whatever we're calling them, and trying to leave in the Delta Plan a list of things, including the spending of significant money but not overwhelming money in the short term, might be one of the most useful things we could do. And I keep saying, I think the political system, if they really roused themselves up, could probably figure out a way to raise from a variety of sources and existing funds, say $1 billion, spend it in 10 years, for the water reliability protection and the ecosystem protection, using the co-equal goals as thematics. Also allows us to do floodplain protection in appropriate ways that have relations to those activities. Because my guess is this political deadlock isn't ever going to be broken because nobody trusts anybody else. And unless we can show that some action can be taken coherently that's better than the deadlock, nobody will be willing to risk anything else. And that goes back to something we talked about earlier, the need to move from a species-by-species environmental consideration to an ecosystem consideration, and the need to move to a pragmatic water demand from the water community that is related to the supply that's available, not the desired amount without regard to supply. You can almost see something that's different but we need the worksheet, and we need that consolidation of these near-term ideas in a format that's understandable, with dollar tags that go with it. We've talked about it.
And
we're going to get there, but we can't start getting there in November. We've got to start seeing the worksheet. We've got to start seeing the consolidation of all these ideas, the near-term ideas that are scattered around the plan to the ones that make sense. And, maybe a serious discussion with, I think, DWR, which is, okay, forget all the interest politics. What are the most immediate things that need to be done to protect the existing water conveyance system? Then you ask yourself the questions, what would be the implications of those immediate things? Everyone likes stockpiles of rocks, which is okay, but that has a practical limit. I mean, we've got to be able to advance on that area. That would be productive.
We will have placeholders for some of that in the next draft of the plan, which comes out Tuesday, and Eric Nickel has committed to me that we'll actually have numbers that we can put in, at least preliminary numbers, into some of that kind of those tables for the next meeting in August. So I expect we will begin building it. You're exactly right. We have to meet with and talk to many of the parties who are involved, who actually, in some cases, money's been appropriated to DWR, to Fish and Game, to the state board. We need to actually understand where that money is, how much is committed, has been actually encumbered, what their plans are, and fit that. We need to put together that puzzle and bring that to you so you can actually see it, and we can actually try and integrate that with the Delta Plan and lay out, okay, over the next 5 years, how do we get by? How do we do the best we can with what we have to make the improvements we need to make?
And I think one of the additional complexities with this worksheet is once you determine what you want to fund, you're going to have to figure out the cost shares. And the big question there is how thorough or how deep are you going to go into that until you reach an agreement that everybody agrees to, or until you reach something that's close enough. And at some level, you're trading off certainty versus certainty, which would facilitate more planning, versus sort of this elusive goal of ultimate accuracy. And you're never going to really be able to decide whether the cost share is exactly 15% or whether it's 15.5%.
But somebody has to pop up with a descriptive approach that is plausible enough to sound serious, with activities that are directed and appear to be balanced in the short run, that allow the governor and the policymakers and all the interest groups to say, well, God, I'd sure do it differently, but I'd rather have things happening than not.
Yeah, and there really is a value there to that certainty. Yeah. I mean, even if you don't agree to the outcome necessarily, it's good to have an outcome at some point rather than drag this on endlessly.
Don.
Yeah, and just listening to a lot of discussion and certainly some of the last comments here, it seems to me that if you're going to, we've heard about need and value and other descriptors, but that, and I think too, what the chair was just talking about and Joe responded to, that you've got to be able to demonstrate some results. It's not just about spending money or saying you've got a need. I think you can recognize you got a need, and I think Hank's point was right on. It's not going to be just value. And those are a little tough to pin down, and I think, again, in the current environment, I don't see it changing dramatically, and I would hope that it would, but I don't see that relative to, I think, not only sentiments amongst voters and just the general citizenry because of their own personal situations, and whether you live in Sacramento or in Central Valley or in Southern California, there may be differences region to region, but I think you've got to demonstrate some results. So I think, again, recognizing that you're not going to have, I think the chair is very accurate. There's not unlimited dollars. There are maybe very limited dollars. That may be the equation you're working with, and I think, as James just said a moment ago, kind of deciding how you ferret that out and who gets to be a party to maybe some expenditure of those dollars, but there's got to be some results. You can talk about the crisis and the need, and nature may help you or may not relative to a wetter year or a drought year. But I think that what Cliff has pointed out to us, what certainly engineers and even the project we talked about this morning, where you can really, again, demonstrate how you've either helped beef up the system as it relates to levee and water supply reliability and maybe some storage, but also if you can stem some of the environmental decline and also, the economic uncertainties that not only lie with the two goals, but as it relates to the delta. I think that's the other key piece here. Now, that may not be the key piece of the electorate, but it certainly is from a standpoint of the focus of what the delta plan is and a lot of this effort. And so I think the 5 years, again, a short time frame in the scheme of things overall, but I think you've got to be able to demonstrate some results. And with the dollars that are available and that might become available, what happens with the bond, we'll see. But I still think that going out to folks and just saying that there's a crisis and there's, value to be having, so forth, and guess what? We got $11 billion you're going to take on in debt. I don't think the environment changes that much between now, the political environment between now and next November. I could be wrong, but that's my sense from a local angle anyway. But I do think that we can get a plan that could say that you could do next 5 years, and here's what we're going to try to do. We've got a lot of strong partners. We recognize the seriousness of the issue that's been handed over to us, and how are we going to demonstrate results over the next few years so that sometime you can go to the voters, if not sooner, rather than maybe later, but also then have other funders be more willing to buy into the solution set. So, and I think part of that again goes back to what you can do with the existing system, and I think the levees and some of the storage projects, some of the environmental projects, and really having some good science behind it as well. That's my thought.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Without trying to oversimplify it, it seems that this commission really has two purposes. One is to make some recommendations, and two is to actually get something done. Now, for me, it's a balance between the essential needs and the money that we have or have access to. And it's almost like giving a Chinese menu, putting that as in a matrix format in that chapter, saying if we have this much money, then these are the things that have to be done, and a ranking of them. But I think that the on the scene and the external factor upon which we have no control at all is the weather and the seismic activity. Now, we have probabilities on there, and you can use an expected value calculation. The probability of 5 or 6 years of drought is not that low. It's fairly high. And if we get great weather conditions over the next 5 or 6 years, we can probably limp along environmentally and with a reliable water supply. However, if we have some unusual, which is no longer unusual weather activity, the heat that we're seeing now, the droughts that we're seeing, and the flooding, if that all moves to California, we really have some problems. And if the probability is high that we're going to have flooding, then you do certain things. Levee repair. If the probability is highest that you've got drought, then you do other things. And you kind of spell all this out and say, these are the factors that we have to understand and make predictions on. And if you do have a high probability of this, then you would do certain actions. And this is what it's going to cost. And these are all essential. Not things that are nice to have, but things that we must have in order to function as a state.
But you also need to focus on the trade-offs, because you can't necessarily, make the system robust.
Get closer to the microphone, please.
Yeah, those are all good points. I would just add that you need to focus on the trade-offs as well, that you can't make the overall system more robust or more resilient to everything.
Well, when you're talking an equation, dollars and activity needs, then you are talking, it's essential in an equation to get those trade-offs. For me, I think.
Ellen?
Just a plug that I think the idea of getting as focused and targeted as possible in the short term in the plan is great, but not to abandon the very helpful language about some of the longer term funding principles and using the first 5 years or some component of that to work out some of these formulas for stressor pays, for example.
I think that's what's intended is that you actually lay out, well, this is what we can do now, but we have to work on these other issues because we have to find a way to fund the water system moving ahead. We can't just ignore it and hope it'll get better.
I think the really dangerous thing, too, are the long lead times involved. You really have to plan 3, minimum 5 years into the future to have any effect on these things. And that's really the difficult part. I mean, it's not as you can see a problem and you can fix it that day. It's going to take years and years to get the funding, to get everything through the legislature, and then to put the shovel in the ground and get it done.
Okay. If you have a bit more time, we're going to ask for some public comments. It would not shock me that somebody wants to ask one of you questions or another, if you don't mind just sitting there for a while. We've got some requests to speak, Pat, if I can get it. And folks, if you could fill out the little blue sheet if you do want to talk. It's important for our records, and we would appreciate it. Mr. Rentz, first. Mr. Rentz from Aqua.
Mark Rentz, Aqua, and as you can tell, Mr. Chairman, I scribbled, I went between 9, 10 on your agenda as great comments and questions were being put forward, but so that do kind of overlap. I was going to start with an article that was in yesterday's Sacramento Bee, but I'm actually going to close with that.
That was Charlie Hoppin's op-ed.
Yes. I want to close with the point that, Don, you raised about the 5-year and put in a sales pitch. Whether you agree or disagree with the specific actions offered up in the Ag Urban Coalition's alternate plan, the approach that you were laying out there and that Hank worked off of is exactly the approach we tried to take in generating actions. If you go back and look at our plan, we have immediate actions, midterm actions, and long-term actions. Immediate actions were based on what is most pragmatic and what is most necessary. Pragmatism was evolved about what do we need to do to address co-equal goals, what can we do, and what can there possibly be funded, recognizing the funding question, the sources of the funding question is still subject to debate. So I couldn't help but bring that pitch forward because maybe there is some opportunity to look at that in the context of what you just discussed. Because that was our intent, get things going on the ground that we can prove success on and start making a difference on. That's my sales pitch. The other piece I want to bring back to you starts with a comment you made, Ellen, and I want to throw it out there. A lot of Aqua members do stewardship activities, as we all know, do aquatic ecosystem improvements, and you referred to a couple of them, Metropolitan's, Sonoma County's operations. I would like to throw out an idea to you all. And for example, on the Sonoma County, there is a very significant science research component of the development of their alternative that they figured out how to fund locally to address improvements to salmonids. Perhaps there is an opportunity here to bring some of those agencies together, and we'd be glad to work with you to share with you what they're doing locally to address some of these issues that may be transferable to a broader approach that you all are looking at what you're doing. Interestingly, there was a discussion about education, and I think Randy raised that question about how do we educate people. I'd also throw out there for your consideration, and I encourage you to go to any of our members or most of our members' websites, and you'll look that there is a very strong education component in what our members do in their normal operations, educating their ratepayers, whether it's flyers in their bills, whether it's their websites, whether it's extensive, depending on their affordability, extensive commercials through mass media, television, news or not. We do educate, and we have seen the success of that education, and maybe there's something to be learned from there, and how can we piggyback on some of those existing local efforts to educate people rather than reinventing the wheel. So I just throw those ideas out there. The third thing I do close with is this article. I don't know who's had a chance to read it yet, in the Sacramento Bee from yesterday's newspaper, and it was Chairman of the State Water Resource Control Board, Charlie Hoppin's op-ed piece on the Yuba Accord. And this is a tremendous example of creativity in my mind. Sure, went through a lot of pain to get to that point, a lot of challenges, and there'll be a lot of pain and a lot of challenges ahead. But what it did was build off of three basic points that I think are critical as we look forward, especially in light of this conversation that you just closed out on the reality check you gave us, Mr. Chairman, about austere times ahead and probably becoming more austere. I think everybody recognizes we're nowhere near out of the woods on that. And that was based on collaboration, and not just collaboration which we traditionally understand between the environmental community and the user community, but also collaboration between people who could provide water above the delta, in the delta, to people who needed the water below, and what that translated into in environmental benefits. And I won't go into details because I don't want to take the time, but I think this article lays that out, that there is a critical role for the marketplace in establishing value, which is what Mr. Boland pointed out and is our first point. By establishing value, the market created revenues that allowed us to achieve improve public benefits or in terms of improving salmonid habitat. So I just kind of wanted to leave it with you. Maybe you want to invite somebody from the Yuba Court as well to come in and talk about this. This may be a model that you want to look at that might work elsewhere. Nothing's going to work everywhere, but it is what I consider a model that we can build upon. So that's the only comments I wanted to make.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Riopel? There you are. Good to see you again.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Bob Riefel. Actually, I'm just here as an old retired accountant. I want to talk a little bit.
Let me write that down. Old retired accountant.
I want to talk a little bit about, or just make one suggestion about how we go about the financing. Something I've seen as an error in a lot of the past bond issues, and that is, as we determine how we're going to finance these things, all those operating costs, admin, planning, oversight, ought to be covered by regular revenues, routine revenues. In the past, we've seen too many bond issues where a very high percentage, and by high, I'm not sure what that high number is, but too high a percentage is spent on not for long-term construction. And if you look back at the last 3 bond issues that they mentioned in this report they just handed out, and if you dug down and you'd see a fairly sizable percentage didn't actually build something. And particularly as you go to try to sell this bond issue the next year, in fact, going back to when it was approved by the legislature, I think some of the negative reaction had to do with some of the specific things they put in there about studies and more operating type expenses that they were trying to finance with long-term financing. In business, we would never do that. We would, your current revenues had to cover all your current expenses, period. And long-term financing only used for construction or building long-term assets. And so I would just strongly recommend, and I think to one of Randy's earlier comments, I think by doing that, it forces you to prioritize. Forces you to say, okay, this is all the money I got. This is how I'm going to spend it this year or this next 3 years. And that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Zuckerman. Tom? Oh, I'm sorry, Pat. Mr. Riopel?
If you just
got a question from Patrick here. Question for an old retired accountant.
Well, I think you're right about misuse of bond money, and it's habitual now. Would you then favor a public goods charge or some other method of paying for those programs and other things that aren't directly related to long-term improvements that you would reserve for bond money or other capital outlay funds?
Yes, I'm not sure how I'd split that, but there are certain things you could tie to specific fees, and we're seeing more and more of that in both state and local agencies. But financing the Department of Water Resources, financing the 3 organizations, those are statewide cost and they be borne statewide. So I don't think it's all just fees. I didn't mean to suggest that, but there has to be a general purpose charge. But then how does that get allocated? That's getting down to the details.
Okay. Thank you very much. Tom? I'm sorry.
I'm Tom Zuckerman. I represent the Central Delta Water Agency along with Mr. Nomalini, who was here earlier this morning. But the way we work that out is I'm an old retired lawyer, and he does the legal work. I'm trying to get the goodwill from your previous speaker here. This has been certainly an interesting conversation today. and one that I have some favorable responses to. I've been encouraging you for some time to look at a staged approach to these problems, particularly given the financial issues that beset not just California, but the national government and so forth. And I think that is the proper way for you to proceed. It's also important to recognize that most of the things that have happened, the positive things that have happened over the last 10 or 20 years have been local initiatives. And a lot of things, these are all local problems. I mean, you can bundle them all up together and they become regional problems or statewide problems, but essentially they're all local problems. I mean, problems that people have to deal with in their communities or in their regions. And to understand that you're much more likely to solve most of these problems by trying to do it at a regional level. And then the role of the state, as I've suggested in previous correspondence to you, becomes more of a regulatory thing to fit the pieces together to make sure that the sum of the regional plans makes sense and that they don't step all over each other, I think is the best way that you can proceed in this environment. It requires a mindset change of thinking that it's the responsibility of the federal government or the state government to solve all these local problems. What it really is it's the initiative of the local areas getting the assistance they need, both from a cost-sharing point of view and from a regulatory point of view, from the state and federal governments to cooperatively solve these local problems in mass. So you really do need a staged plan. I've suggested to you, in addition, that your environmental impact statement or report, whichever it is, would be much more doable if you concentrated on a first stage type of an approach where you actually have something concrete that you can analyze and look at alternatives to. But when you start talking in abstracts about things that are going to happen 100 years from now, that becomes a very difficult thing not only to write but also to support, I would think, legally. In the meantime, there are some things that are going on that are very positive that I think you have to be very careful not to interfere with and to put obstacles in the way of them to prevent the good things that are happening from continuing to happen. And I raised the ire of at least two of you at the last meeting that I attended over the discussion of the Delta levy standards. But I think it's a big issue from a local point of view that we've been working collectively towards building PL 8499 levies in the Delta for 20 years, and we've had measurable success in that regard with a nominal amount of actually in these terms of state support for those programs. We had tremendous cooperation between the locals on a cost-sharing basis with the state, and in very isolated instances the federal government, on trying to build our levees to make a more sustainable future. Several people have commented to you on the pitfall of this table 7.1 in your plan, in your draft plan. And you've got to get rid of that concept that the hazard mitigation is a levy standard. That's not what we're building towards. And if you leave that implication in your plan, and everybody who has a levy project trying to get to PL 8499 has to come here as a covered activity to make sure it's consistent with some relatively vague notion that's in that chart and in your plan today, you're going to foul up this process which has been working beautifully for the last 20 years. So please take that seriously. I think I'm beginning to get a little panicky because each meeting is one closer to the last, and you get to your final plan, and it's still in there. But please pay some attention to that and help us out on that, if you will, please. The dredging is the other issue, and I think it's part of what needs to happen, both from a short-term and a long-term basis, if we're going to be doing any construction on an economical basis in the Delta. I was a little bit taken aback by your newsletter, which a big portion of it concentrated on what appeared to be a sort of a negative statement about dredging that was apparently came out of a question that Randy, you addressed to Jeff Mount at some meeting that I wasn't at. And understand that Mount's views on this and my views are not really inconsistent with one another. You know, he was talking about, no, we don't want to go in and deepen the channels in the western delta because that would cause salinity intrusion. Well, we agree with that. We also are sensitive to the issues of liberating toxics that are in the sediments in the delta, and we've developed ways of dealing with that, with sediment curtains and so forth and so on. But he does not disagree that the need for dredging in the delta for flood control and levee maintenance are, you know, is an important element of this. So please don't allow off comments to dominate your thinking on that subject. And if you really want to pursue it more, let's get a panel together here of the experts, and you can talk about the pros and cons of dredging and how it should go forward.
Don, then Randy.
Yeah, just to kind of a question for staff while Tom's still at the podium there, that we've gotten a good deal of correspondence, and certainly Tom's letter on the levee standards and how that may affect certainly timing of work and the ability to continue to make improvements that in other letters people have identified relative to tidal actions and so forth that really may have avoided or averted other far more serious either levee failures and or other issues, because people have been able to, over the past 25 years plus, make a number of improvements on the levees. I guess I'm curious about, are we going to, with the meeting in August, come back to discussion about not just that chapter, but about the table and so forth? And we've gotten a lot of letters and correspondence on the levee subvention program, and standing behind that. But Tom has been pretty specific in his concerns about this agricultural standard and the covered actions, consistency, and how that can interrupt a pretty, I think, a refined flow of work and dollars and project considerations that we might, depending on what we do, I guess, and how it is supplied, interrupt that and could have far greater impact in a negative sense. And so I guess I'm maybe for Joe or somebody anyway.
Let me describe what I think the direction was. We have had a number of comments, and there were verbal comments at the last meeting about the extending of the sunset on the subvention program, and we had already in the Delta Plan in Chapter 9 a recommendation that the subvention program, that we find more funding for the subvention program, and we actually, I believe, amended the language that would come out in the draft plan that will be out on Tuesday that says we should extend the sunset of the Delta Subventions program while we're finding funding for the subvention program. So we don't say it should go away permanently, but we say that we should extend it while we're figuring out the funding for subventions moving ahead in general terms. And I don't even remember the exact language. I'm not sure that I've seen it, but that will be in the next version. Table 7-1 is the one that talks about levee standards. And we had a lot of discussion about what to do about agricultural levees, if you will. And at one point, internally even, we talked about, well, should we set the standards higher? And one of the comments that we had was that there are, in fact, places where you want to have relatively low levees because you want them to be in the floodplain, because you want the ag land to flood, and then you want to be able to come back and reuse it as ag land, but once every 5 years or every 10 years, whatever it is, you want that to happen. So we didn't want to say that all agricultural land should meet the 84-99 standard. So we don't say that. As I understand what Tom is asking for, and this will be good to get the clarification, is you would like us to recommend that all islands that don't have as a significant purpose this ecosystem, this floodplain enhancement, that they all meet the 84-99 standard? Is that what you're asking for?
Yeah, well, the way it's been handled in the past is there have been flood easements purchased on those islands where, they're for flood protection and so forth. It's important that they don't build their levee above a certain height. Now, the issue with PL 89 versus the hazard mitigation plan is not one of height, because it has the same height in it.
Right.
It's the strength of the levee. So if you want to have controlled flooding of areas in the delta, which might be appropriate, as it might be appropriate upstream in historic flood areas
Yellow
or
bypass,
bypasses and
Susun
so
Marsh,
forth,
there are
that's
places
fine.
where.
But that ought to be a deliberate program. It shouldn't be a situation where we say, well, if we just cut back on the support for the levee program or the standards and so forth, enough of these levees will flood, that it'll take care of our problem. That's not a deliberate plan.
I don't think that's
the way
what the
it should
plan
happen.
is intended to do. I think the plan was intended to give flexibility for local agencies to make the appropriate decision for any given island, so that if one island needs 84-99 or 100-year levy or PL or HMP or no standard, that they could do that.
Well, every reclamation district in the Delta is building toward 84-99. The problem with that standard is, or that using the hazard mitigation thing, is it sheds some doubt upon that.
Well, you're using the delta as the legal delta, and
right.
Understand when we use the delta, we include the Susun Marsh.
Yeah, well, the marsh is never.
But it's part of our act.
Separate issue, yeah, separate issue, and you should distinguish between those. But all I'm saying is this has been an awfully, awfully effective program. It's gotten a lot of local support. Over 50% of the money that's gone into that program has come from the locals, even though there's an opportunity for 75% cost sharing from the state. The state's never really put in enough money to meet that level of funding. And I don't think you really want to stop that, because then you'd be taking 10 steps backwards with this program. It's a relatively simple thing. If you want to work on the wording and so forth, I'd be happy to get a group of people together that are really knowledgeable about the thing to help you with
I
it.
don't think the plan stops that plan, but if the council wants us to do more that specifically says that's.
Well, the fact of the matter is we don't want to have to come back here for a consistency determination every time we
let's
try
see
to build
language.
a
Let's
levy.
talk specifically about the language that you'd like modified, changed, adjusted, revised, rewritten, whatever you want, so we know specifically what we're talking about. That would be helpful.
We'll be happy to work with your staff on that. It'd
Great.
be hard to negotiate it here standing up, and I'm not really the person to do that. So.
I've watched you negotiate standing up before.
Well, if I get to my full height.
Thanks, man. Mr. Chair.
Great.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you very
Tom,
much.
thank you very much. Do we have other requests? Okay. Anyone else in the members? This is the last item on the agenda. I'm astonished we moved this fast. But I'm also going to open it for general comments to the council for anything not on the agenda. If there's anyone in the audience who would like to do that, now would be the time to do it. And seeing no one rising to their feet for that purpose. Joe, what do you need concluded, if anything else? Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Thank you. You got the secret offline communications you're all going to give so we can to Alan. the sooner you give it to him, the faster he can reflect it. And if you even agree that he might share some of your thoughts with us, that would be helpful too. The discussion, I thought, was productive in trying to focus us on the dilemma. If any of you develop the absolutely perfect solution to a grim financial picture for the economy and the reticence of the public to tax themselves for much of anything, we'd sure like to know it soon.
So would people in Congress.
Yeah, so would everybody. Anyway, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, there's Ellen brought a handout on just the most recent blog she referenced, so we could get that into the record.
Okay, good. We will do that.
Thank
you. Keep those blogs coming there for those of you who don't read the periodic blog and posts that come out of the UCD PPIC combo. You ought to. It's very, very helpful. Very helpful. Okay. Anything else, Joe?
Yes. You asked me for a date.
A date.
And
You're
Keith
correct.
has helpfully worked through all of the dates that we have here and actually talked with Mr. Nordhoff about a date that we can commit to, and they came up with the date of December the 23rd for adoption of the Delta Plan. And he's worked through all of this in detail, but laid out.
Let's do this. Let's reflect in the minutes of this meeting, that comment has been made. I'm not going to ask council members to vote for that at this time, but let's bring it back in August, Joe.
Will do.
The subject, the discussion,
with an
and
actual
the date.
detailed schedule. And
Mr. Chair, I happen to like all of you, but I don't know if I want to spend the day before Christmas Eve with all of you. But
you just took a vacation.
I know, but I'm talking about Christmas, the day before Christmas Eve. But if that's necessary, I guess we'll.
That's a holiday too?
No, I didn't say that.
Yeah. Anything else? Members, anything else? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Meeting is adjourned.